Paris, 1760s. Two of the most famous intellectuals in Europe lived in the same city, knew the same people, read each other's work, and never once sat down together. Not because of distance or circumstance. They avoided each other deliberately. Voltaire thought Rousseau was a dangerous lunatic. Rousseau believed Voltaire represented everything corrupt about civilization. Voltaire was wealthy. He made a fortune exploiting a poorly designed government lottery in 1729. He and a mathematician friend realized they could guarantee profits by buying enough tickets. They did this systematically until authorities closed the loophole. He invested the money shrewdly in government bonds, army supply contracts, and real estate. By middle age, he was one of the richest writers in Europe. Rousseau lived in poverty most of his life. He supported himself copying music by hand, tedious work that paid poorly. In 1752, after achieving literary fame, he was offered a royal pension that would have guaranteed comfortable income forever. He refused it. Accepting money from the king would create obligation. He preferred poverty to dependence. Between 1746 and 1751, Rousseau's partner, Thérèse Levasseur, gave birth to 5 children. Rousseau sent all of them to a foundling hospital, an institution where most children died. He knew this. He did it anyway. Years later, he wrote Émile, the most influential book on child-rearing and education in European history. The contradiction was obvious to everyone, including Rousseau himself, who confessed to it in his autobiography. Voltaire lived with Émilie du Châtelet for 15 years. She was a mathematician and physicist who translated Newton's Principia into French. They worked together as intellectual equals, conducting scientific experiments and writing philosophical treatises. When she died in 1749, Voltaire was devastated. He never formed another relationship of comparable depth. In 1755, an earthquake destroyed Lisbon. Between 30 and 60,000 people died. The earthquake struck on All Saints' Day, a major Catholic holiday. Churches full of worshippers collapsed. Fires consumed the ruins. A tsunami swept through the harbor. It was one of the worst natural disasters in European history. Voltaire wrote a poem questioning divine providence. If God was good and all-powerful, why did thousands die, many while praying in churches? The poem challenged the philosophical optimism popular at the time, the idea that this was the best of all possible worlds. Rousseau responded with a long letter defending God. The earthquake wasn't divine punishment, but the result of natural laws. Humans made it worse by building fragile cities in earthquake zones. He suggested that death might not be the worst evil, that survivors might learn important lessons. The letter also criticized Voltaire personally, implying that his comfortable life in a fine house made him unable to understand real faith. Voltaire reportedly remarked that Rousseau's letter made him want to walk on all fours. He found the arguments absurd. 3 years later, he published Candide, a satirical novel that savagely mocked philosophical optimism. The Lisbon earthquake appears in the story. The character Pangloss insists everything happens for the best even as disasters pile up. Rousseau never forgave the mockery. He saw Candide as an attack not just on philosophy, but on faith itself. In 1758, Rousseau published a letter arguing that Geneva should not permit theaters. He claimed theater was morally corrupting. Actors made a profession of deception, pretending to be people they weren't. Audiences learned to value performance over authenticity. Even plays depicting virtue did so in ways that made virtue theatrical rather than genuine. Voltaire loved theater and had written dozens of plays. He found Rousseau's position ridiculous. Theater was one of civilization's great achievements. Drama could teach moral lessons and challenge prejudice. Banning it was provincial narrow-mindedness. The theater debate was partly about aesthetics and partly personal. Voltaire wanted to establish a theater near Geneva for his own entertainment. Rousseau's letter defending the ban implicitly criticized Voltaire's influence on the city. When Rousseau's Émile was published in 1762, authorities in Paris and Geneva condemned it. The book was burned publicly. Warrants were issued for Rousseau's arrest. He fled France to avoid prison. The persecution was real, not imagined. But Rousseau's response went beyond reasonable caution. He began seeing conspiracies everywhere. Former friends were plotting against him. Strangers recognized and mocked him on the street. The entire network of Enlightenment philosophers, including Voltaire, Diderot, and d'Alembert, had supposedly formed a conspiracy to destroy his reputation and drive him mad. No such conspiracy existed. His former friends were hurt and angry about his accusations, but they weren't coordinating efforts to persecute him. David Hume invited Rousseau to England in 1766, securing him a pension and accommodation. Within months, Rousseau became convinced that Hume was the conspiracy's leader. He accused Hume based on misunderstood jokes and innocent actions reinterpreted as sinister. Hume was bewildered. The public quarrel that followed damaged both men's reputations. Voltaire did attack Rousseau deliberately at least once. He anonymously published a pamphlet revealing Rousseau's abandonment of his children. This was calculated to destroy Rousseau's moral credibility at a vulnerable moment. It worked. But this specific attack was different from the vast conspiracy Rousseau imagined. Voltaire's hostility was intermittent and opportunistic, not part of an organized campaign. By the late 1760s, Rousseau was genuinely paranoid in the clinical sense. He moved frequently, unable to stay anywhere long before becoming convinced people were plotting against him. He broke with almost everyone who tried to help him. He lived in increasing isolation. Both men died in 1778. Voltaire in May, Rousseau in July. Voltaire died in Paris, having returned in triumph after years of exile. He was celebrated, visited by crowds, treated as a hero despite controversy. Rousseau died in obscurity at a patron's estate outside Paris, isolated and fearful. 11 years later, the French Revolution began. The revolutionaries needed intellectual heroes. They chose both Voltaire and Rousseau, claiming them as fathers of the revolution despite their opposing philosophies. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen reflected Voltaire's emphasis on individual liberty and legal equality. The attack on church power echoed his anti-clericalism. Legal reforms abolishing torture and arbitrary punishment followed his campaigns for justice. But as the revolution radicalized, Rousseau's influence became dominant. Robespierre cited the social contract constantly. The concept of general will became revolutionary doctrine. The Jacobins claimed to represent the people's singular will, justifying the terror through Rousseauan language about forcing people to be free. In 1791, Voltaire's remains were transferred to the Pantheon in an elaborate ceremony. In 1794, Rousseau's body was moved there as well. The same monument honored both men. The same revolution claimed both as inspirations. Two completely opposite political philosophies, both invoked to justify the same events. Neither man would have recognized or approved what was done in his name. Voltaire opposed fanaticism and mob violence. He would have been horrified by the terror. Rousseau described ideal conditions for legitimate authority, not a blueprint for revolutionary dictatorship. He would likely have rejected the violence committed using his concepts. But the ideas they articulated shaped what happened. Voltaire's critique of arbitrary authority and emphasis on individual rights provided revolutionary ideology. Rousseau's vision of popular sovereignty and general will gave revolutionaries their political theory. The revolution combined these incompatible elements in ways neither anticipated. Their argument continued long after both were dead. It continues still. Liberal democracy tries to combine individual rights with popular sovereignty. Representative government attempts to maintain legitimacy through consent while limiting direct participation. Constitutional protections constrain what majorities can do. These are all attempts to reconcile Voltairean and Rousseauan principles that remain in tension. The story of their conflict is the story of contradictions we inherited. Two brilliant men who defined modern thought by disagreeing about almost everything fundamental. They never resolved their differences, neither did we. Paris in the 1750s was a city of salons, coffee houses, and endless conversation. Intellectuals gathered in drawing rooms to debate ideas that would reshape the world. In this small, interconnected world of thinkers and writers, two men stood out above all others. Both were famous, both were controversial, both lived in Paris at the same time, yet they never sat down together for a meal. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire occupied the same intellectual universe but maintained a careful distance. They knew of each other, read each other's work, and occasionally exchanged letters. But a face-to-face meeting never occurred. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice, particularly on Rousseau's part. Voltaire, the elder of the two by 18 years, had already established himself as the leading voice of the French Enlightenment when Rousseau arrived in Paris. He was witty, connected, and comfortable in aristocratic circles. Rousseau came from humbler origins and never fully adapted to Parisian society. Where Voltaire thrived on social interaction, Rousseau felt increasingly uncomfortable in crowds. The absence of a meeting between them reveals something fundamental about their personalities and philosophies. Voltaire believed in the power of conversation, debate, and social refinement. He surrounded himself with intelligent people and enjoyed the clash of ideas in person. Rousseau grew to distrust these very gatherings. He saw them as artificial, full of pretense and hidden agendas. Their correspondence shows mutual respect turning gradually into suspicion. In early letters, Rousseau addressed Voltaire with admiration, even reverence. Voltaire responded politely but with a certain condescension. As years passed, their exchanges grew cooler. Rousseau began to see Voltaire as the embodiment of everything wrong with civilized society. Voltaire came to view Rousseau as unstable and dangerously radical. The closest they came to meeting was in 1754, when Rousseau passed through Geneva while Voltaire was living nearby. Rousseau chose not to visit. Later, he would claim that he already sensed their fundamental incompatibility. Whether this was true or a rationalization created in hindsight is impossible to know. What's certain is that Rousseau avoided the encounter. This avoidance became more pointed after their public dispute over the Lisbon earthquake. What began as a philosophical disagreement turned personal. Rousseau felt that Voltaire had mocked him in print. Voltaire believed Rousseau had misunderstood his arguments and responded with characteristic sarcasm. Any possibility of a friendly meeting evaporated. By the 1760s, when both men had left Paris, the idea of them sitting together had become unthinkable. Rousseau's paranoia had deepened. He saw conspiracies everywhere and counted Voltaire among his enemies. Voltaire, for his part, had lost patience with what he viewed as Rousseau's theatrical self-pity and contradictory positions. The dinner that never happened represents more than personal animosity. It symbolizes two incompatible visions of intellectual life. Voltaire believed progress came through conversation, through the exchange of ideas in civilized settings. Rousseau came to believe that such settings corrupted honest thought, that truth required solitude and introspection. Their refusal to meet also reflected different attitudes toward conflict. Voltaire enjoyed intellectual combat. He was brilliant in argument, quick with devastating replies, comfortable with confrontation. Rousseau found such exchanges painful. He preferred to work out his ideas alone in writing, where he could control the terms of engagement. In the end, the absence of this meeting may have been inevitable. Two men with such different temperaments and philosophies might have found a dinner together unbearable. The conversation would likely have ended in argument, possibly an insult. The distance they maintained allowed their ideas to clash on paper, where both were at their strongest, rather than across a table, where Voltaire's wit would have dominated and Rousseau's sensitivity would have been wounded. The intellectual world they shared was small enough that their paths should have crossed many times. That they never did shows how deliberately Rousseau in particular structured his life to avoid such encounters. He left Paris partly to escape the very social world that Voltaire embodied. Their parallel lives, never quite touching, set the pattern for their intellectual legacies running side by side through history, influential but forever separate. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712. His mother died 9 days after his birth. His father, Isaac Rousseau, was a watchmaker, a skilled craftsman who belonged to Geneva's middle class but possessed no significant wealth or social standing. The city itself was a Protestant republic, strict in its morals, proud of its independence from both Catholic France and the Holy Roman Empire. Rousseau's childhood was unstable. His father taught him to read using romance novels, an unusual choice that filled the boy's head with idealized notions of love and honor. When Rousseau was 10, his father got into a legal dispute and fled Geneva to avoid imprisonment. The boy was left in the care of relatives who showed him little warmth. At 13, he was apprenticed to an engraver who treated him harshly. At 16, he walked away from Geneva and never returned to live there permanently. This early life marked Rousseau deeply. He experienced abandonment, instability, and the casual cruelty that often accompanied low social status. He learned what it meant to be powerless, to depend on the whims of others, to lack the protection that wealth and family connections provided. These experiences would later inform his political philosophy and his critique of inequality. François-Marie Arouet, who would become known as Voltaire, was born in Paris in 1694 into an entirely different world. His father was a notary, a position that placed the family securely in the Parisian bourgeoisie. More importantly, his father had wealthy clients and connections throughout the legal and aristocratic circles of the capital. Voltaire received the education appropriate to his class. He attended the College Louis-le-Grand, a prestigious Jesuit school where the sons of nobility studied alongside wealthy commoners. There he received rigorous training in Latin, rhetoric, and classical literature. His teachers recognized his intellectual gifts early. He made friends among the aristocratic students, connections that would serve him throughout his life. Unlike Rousseau, Voltaire grew up with stability and clear expectations. His father wanted him to become a lawyer and pursue a respectable career. Voltaire had other ideas, but he rebelled from a position of security, not desperation. When he chose writing over law, it was a deliberate rejection of a comfortable path that was genuinely available to him. The contrast in their early experiences with education is particularly revealing. Rousseau's formal schooling was minimal and frequently interrupted. He was largely self-taught, reading whatever he could find, pursuing knowledge without guidance or system. This gave his learning a passionate but unsystematic quality. He absorbed ideas deeply but sometimes misunderstood their original context. Voltaire's education was structured, comprehensive, and designed to produce a cultured gentleman. He learned to write with clarity and precision. He studied the classics in their original languages. He absorbed the rules of good taste and proper argument. His intellectual style reflected this training, organized, controlled, devastatingly effective in conventional debate. Their relationships with religion also began differently. Rousseau grew up in Protestant Geneva, where religious observance was strict but also deeply connected to civic identity. The city's Protestantism emphasized individual conscience and direct relationship with God. Even after Rousseau converted to Catholicism as a teenager, a largely opportunistic move to gain support from a wealthy patroness, he retained this sense of personal religious feeling. Voltaire was raised Catholic, but in the more relaxed Parisian style. His Jesuit teachers were sophisticated men who valued classical learning and rhetorical skill. They taught him to argue, to question, to examine ideas critically. While they remained Catholic, they gave him the intellectual tools that he would later use to critique religious authority. The cities themselves shaped these men. Geneva was small, insular, and obsessed with moral purity. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Social hierarchies were maintained through constant surveillance and judgment. Paris was vast, diverse, and full of contradictions. It offered opportunities for social mobility, but also exposed one constantly to inequality and injustice. Rousseau would later idealize the republican virtue he associated with Geneva, while simultaneously resenting its narrow-mindedness. Voltaire would defend Paris as the center of civilization, while recognizing its corruption and cruelty. Each man's relationship with his birthplace was complicated, but those complications arose from very different starting points. By the time both men reached adulthood, their paths had diverged fundamentally. Voltaire moved smoothly into Parisian literary society, already confident in his abilities and his place in the world. Rousseau wandered from city to city, working as a secretary, a music teacher, a tutor, never quite finding stable ground. Voltaire cultivated aristocratic patrons as equals. Rousseau depended on them as a subordinate, always aware of the power imbalance. These different beginnings created different sensibilities. Voltaire believed in merit and talent as paths to advancement because his own experience confirmed this. Rousseau saw how birth and connections determined life chances because he had struggled without them. Their philosophies didn't emerge from abstract reasoning alone, but from the concrete realities of their early lives. In 1750, the Academy of Dijon announced an essay competition. The question posed was whether the restoration of the arts and sciences had contributed to the purification of morals. Most expected answers would praise progress and learning. Rousseau, then 38 and largely unknown, submitted an essay arguing the opposite. He won first prize and became famous overnight. The discourse on the arts and sciences presented a startling thesis. Rousseau argued that advances in knowledge and culture had not improved human morality. Instead, they had corrupted it. He pointed to ancient Sparta, simple and virtuous, compared to Athens, refined and decadent. He claimed that as societies became more civilized, people became more vicious, more dishonest, more concerned with appearance than reality. This wasn't a call to return to caves or abandon all learning. Rousseau's argument was more subtle. He suggested that progress in arts and sciences created new forms of inequality and new opportunities for deception. In simple societies, people dealt with each other directly. In complex civilizations, elaborate manners and cultural sophistication allowed people to hide their true intentions. Politeness became a mask for exploitation. Rousseau developed these ideas further in his Discourse on Inequality, published 5 years later. Here he traced the origins of human society from a hypothetical state of nature through various stages of development. Each advance brought new problems. Private property created inequality. Division of labor created dependence. Complex social structures created alienation. People lost touch with their authentic selves, their natural goodness, and became corrupted by comparison, competition, and the need for approval from others. Voltaire read these works with growing irritation. To him, Rousseau's arguments were not just wrong but dangerous. Voltaire had spent his life celebrating human achievement in arts, literature, science, and philosophy. The idea that these accomplishments had somehow corrupted humanity struck him as absurd and ungrateful. In Voltaire's view, civilization represented humanity's greatest triumph over ignorance and brutality. He pointed to medical advances that saved lives, legal reforms that protected the innocent, philosophical ideas that challenged superstition. Without arts and sciences, people lived in darkness, at the mercy of disease, tyranny, and religious fanaticism. Progress wasn't perfect, but it was infinitely preferable to the alternative. Voltaire saw Rousseau's praise of simplicity as naive romanticism. Life in so-called simple societies was harsh, short, and brutal. There was nothing noble about illiteracy, nothing virtuous about lacking the resources to develop human potential. Rousseau seemed to idealize poverty and ignorance from the comfort of civilized society, benefiting from the very culture he criticized. The disagreement went deeper than different assessments of historical facts. It reflected fundamentally different views of human nature. Rousseau believed humans were naturally good but corrupted by society. Remove the corrupting influences, or at least recognize them, and natural goodness could reassert itself. This natural goodness wasn't sophisticated or refined, but it was authentic and moral. Voltaire held a darker view of innate human nature. People were capable of terrible cruelty and needed civilization to restrain and channel their destructive impulses. Laws, education, cultural refinement, these were not corruptions but necessary improvements. Without them, human life would be governed by violence and superstition. These opposing views led to different political conclusions. Rousseau sought ways to preserve or recover human authenticity within social structures. His ideal was a community of equals, relatively simple in organization, where people maintained direct connection to each other and to their own nature. Complexity and sophistication were suspect because they created opportunities for some to dominate others. Voltaire advocated for enlightened reform within existing civilization, make laws more rational, reduce the power of church and superstition, promote education and culture, protect individual rights. The goal wasn't to simplify society, but to improve it, to make civilization more just while maintaining its achievements. Their debate about civilization touched on uncomfortable contradictions in Enlightenment thought. The same period that celebrated reason and progress also produced unprecedented critiques of that very progress. Rousseau articulated doubts that many felt but couldn't express. Was modern life really better? Did refinement and sophistication make people happier or just more anxious? Did progress serve everyone or mainly those already privileged? Voltaire dismissed these doubts as sentimental nonsense, yet his own work revealed awareness of civilization's flaws. He witnessed and documented terrible injustices, religious persecution, judicial murders, abuse of power by the educated and sophisticated. His campaigns for justice acknowledged that civilization could be monstrously unjust, but his response was to demand better civilization, not less of it. The practical implications of their disagreement emerged in their attitudes toward education and culture. Rousseau grew increasingly skeptical of theaters, academies, and salons. He saw these institutions as reinforcing artificial values and social hierarchies. Education should develop natural capacities, not impose conventional knowledge. Culture should express authentic feeling, not display sophisticated technique. Voltaire remained committed to these very institutions as vehicles for progress. Theaters could challenge prejudice through drama. Academies could advance knowledge through collective inquiry. Salons could spread enlightened ideas through conversation. Education should transmit the best that humanity had achieved. Culture should aspire to excellence and refinement. Neither man offered a simple or entirely consistent position. Rousseau enjoyed the acclaim that civilized society gave his writings. Voltaire acknowledged that civilization produced vanity, corruption, and suffering. But their emphases differed fundamentally. Rousseau saw what civilization cost in terms of authenticity and equality. Voltaire saw what it gained in terms of knowledge and freedom from superstition. Rousseau believed happiness came from living in harmony with oneself. In his ideal, a person would want only what they could achieve, need only what was genuinely necessary, and maintain independence from the opinions of others. This required simplicity, both in material conditions and in social relations. Complexity created desire for things one didn't need, comparison with others that bred dissatisfaction, dependence on external validation. He described this ideal most fully in Emile, his treatise on education. The tutor raises the boy away from society's corrupting influences, teaching him to rely on his own abilities, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures, to value authenticity over appearance. Emile learns a trade so he'll never depend entirely on others. He connects with nature, understands his place in the world without grandiose ambitions. He develops his capacity for genuine feeling rather than sophisticated but hollow sentiment. This vision of happiness centered on what Rousseau called amour de soi, a healthy self-love rooted in meeting real needs. He contrasted this with amour propre, the corrupted self-love that comes from comparison with others, from wanting to be admired, from defining oneself through social status. Modern civilization, in his view, cultivated amour propre and made people miserable in the process. Rousseau's own life suggested he struggled to achieve the happiness he prescribed. He was deeply sensitive to criticism, desperately wanted recognition for his work, and fell into bitter disputes with former friends. His emotional life was turbulent, marked by intense attachments and equally intense breaks. Yet he insisted these troubles came from his unavoidable involvement in civilized society, not from flaws in his philosophy. Voltaire's conception of happiness differed entirely. He valued comfort, intellectual stimulation, good conversation, fine food and wine, beautiful surroundings, and engaging work. Happiness wasn't found by withdrawing from civilization, but by enjoying its best offerings while maintaining critical distance from its absurdities. At Ferney, the estate where Voltaire spent his final decades, he created an environment reflecting these values. He built a comfortable house, established a theater, maintained extensive correspondence with intellectuals across Europe, wrote prolifically, and involved himself in various business ventures. He cultivated his garden both literally and metaphorically, creating beauty and productivity around himself. Voltaire's life embodied a particular Enlightenment ideal. The cultivated person who combined learning with pleasure, seriousness with wit, engagement with the world with skepticism about its pretensions. He didn't seek simplicity or withdrawal. He wanted to live well in the world as it was, improving it where possible while enjoying what it offered. The contrast appeared starkly in their attitudes toward material possessions. Rousseau increasingly rejected luxury and accumulation. He made a point of living modestly, copying music for income, refusing gifts that would create obligation. This wasn't just financial necessity, it was a moral stance. Accumulating wealth and possessions tied one to society in corrupting ways, created false needs, and distracted from authentic life. Voltaire made shrewd investments and became wealthy. He didn't see this as corruption, but as security and independence. Money freed him from dependence on aristocratic patrons. It allowed him to live where and how he chose, to pursue projects that interested him, to help others. He was generous with his wealth, funding various causes and supporting younger writers, but he saw no virtue in poverty. Their views on pleasure also diverged. Rousseau was suspicious of refined pleasures, seeing them as artificial and ultimately unsatisfying. True pleasure came from simple sources: a walk in nature, honest conversation, the satisfaction of work completed. Sophisticated entertainment, elaborate meals, and cultural events were distractions that prevented people from connecting with genuine feeling. Voltaire celebrated precisely these refined pleasures: a well-prepared meal with good company, an evening at the theater, music performed with skill. These were among life's worthwhile experiences. They required civilization to produce and education to appreciate fully. Far from being distractions, they were among the things that made human life worth living. The role of other people in happiness divided them as well. Rousseau increasingly sought solitude, claiming it was necessary for authentic self-knowledge. Society forced people to play roles, to present false versions of themselves. Only alone could one connect with one's true nature. Even close relationships became suspect because they created dependence and obligation. Voltaire remained deeply social throughout his life. He thrived on conversation, correspondence, and collaboration. Happiness required engagement with other minds, the stimulation of debate, the pleasure of wit shared and appreciated. Solitude might be necessary for concentrated work, but it wasn't a condition for authentic living. People were social beings who found meaning through connection. These different conceptions of happiness reflected their different assessments of human nature and society. If society corrupts and authentic life requires simplicity, then Rousseau's path makes sense. If civilization enables human flourishing and refinement represents genuine achievement, then Voltaire's approach is more compelling. Neither offered a universally applicable formula. Rousseau's ideal suited his temperament: solitary, introspective, uncomfortable with social performance. Voltaire's suited his: sociable, intellectually restless, comfortable with worldly success. Each man described the conditions for his own happiness and presented them as generally valid. The question of which vision proved more influential is complicated. Rousseau inspired romantic movements that celebrated nature, authenticity, and emotion. His influence appeared in everything from educational theory to nature poetry to political revolution. Voltaire's legacy shaped liberal institutions, rational reform, and skeptical inquiry. Both visions of happiness persist in modern culture, sometimes in the same person. Voltaire spent much of his adult life in the company of kings, aristocrats, and the wealthy elite of Europe. These weren't merely social connections, they were relationships he cultivated deliberately, recognizing that power and influence flowed through these circles. He corresponded with Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and numerous other monarchs and nobles. He understood how to navigate court politics, when to flatter and when to challenge, how to maintain his independence while benefiting from patronage. This comfort with power came partly from his upbringing in Parisian bourgeois society, where connections to nobility were normal and desirable. but it also reflected his pragmatic philosophy. Voltaire believed that enlightened ideas needed powerful advocates to become reality. Legal reforms, religious tolerance, protection of individual rights, these required action by those who controlled the machinery of government. Cultivating relationships with the powerful wasn't selling out, it was strategic. His time at Frederick's court in Prussia illustrated both the opportunities and dangers of this approach. Frederick invited Voltaire to Potsdam, offering generous financial support and intellectual companionship. For several years, Voltaire lived there, enjoying the king's favor and working on his philosophical and historical writings. The arrangement gave him security and influence, but also made him dependent on royal whim. The relationship eventually soured. Frederick proved more autocratic than enlightened when his interests were threatened. Voltaire discovered that friendship with a king was never between equals. When he tried to leave, Frederick made the departure difficult and humiliating. Yet even after this bitter experience, Voltaire continued to correspond with monarchs and seek their support for causes he believed in. Voltaire's approach to power was fundamentally instrumental. He didn't idealize aristocrats or believe in their inherent superiority. Many were fools or tyrants, but they controlled resources and authority. Working with enlightened members of the elite seemed more practical than opposing the entire system. Reform from above, guided by philosophical principles, could achieve more than popular revolution. This didn't mean Voltaire ignored injustice committed by the powerful. His campaigns against judicial murders and religious persecution targeted specific abuses by authorities. He used his connections and reputation to pressure officials, mobilize public opinion, and seek redress for victims. But he worked within existing power structures, appealing to reason and enlightened self-interest rather than calling for their overthrow. Rousseau's relationship with power was entirely different. He depended on aristocratic patrons for much of his life but resented that dependence deeply, working as a secretary to wealthy benefactors, living in accommodations they provided, accepting gifts and stipends. All these necessary arrangements felt like humiliation. He experienced firsthand the psychological cost of inequality, the way dependence corrupted relationships and prevented honest interaction. Several times Rousseau tried to escape this dependence by refusing patronage. He attempted to support himself through music copying and other modest work. These efforts reflected his conviction that accepting money from the powerful compromised one's integrity and independence. Even when poverty resulted, he preferred it to obligation. His political philosophy grew directly from these experiences. The social contract envisions a community of rough equals where no one has power to dominate others. Political legitimacy comes from the general will of citizens, not from the authority of monarchs or aristocrats. Rousseau wasn't proposing practical reforms within existing systems. He was describing an alternative foundation for political organization. This radicalism made Rousseau dangerous to established order in ways Voltaire never was. Voltaire criticized specific abuses and argued for incremental improvements. His writings could embarrass authorities but didn't threaten fundamental power relations. Rousseau's work questioned the very basis of hierarchical society. Even if he didn't explicitly call for revolution, his ideas provided intellectual ammunition for those who would. The personal psychology behind these different approaches mattered as much as philosophical principles. Voltaire genuinely enjoyed the company of intelligent aristocrats. He found court life stimulating despite its absurdities. He was skilled at the games of wit and influence that such environments required. His ego was robust enough to handle the slights and condescension that came with his position. Rousseau lacked this psychological resilience. He took offense easily, saw insults where none were intended, and couldn't separate intellectual disagreement from personal attack. The artificiality of aristocratic society, which Voltaire found amusing, Rousseau found unbearable. He wasn't temperamentally suited to the role of court philosopher, and knew it. Their different relationships with power also reflected different assessments of human nature at the top of society. Voltaire believed some individuals, through education and temperament, were genuinely superior in ability and judgment. An enlightened monarch or aristocrat could accomplish more good than democratic masses swayed by passion and superstition. The goal was to cultivate and empower these exceptional individuals. Rousseau rejected this notion of natural aristocracy. No one was qualified to rule others simply by birth or education. Power corrupted even the well-intentioned. The only legitimate authority came from the collective will of citizens who were genuinely equal. This equality wasn't just legal, but psychological and moral. No person should be in a position where they depended on another's arbitrary will. The practical consequences of these views appeared in their political recommendations. Voltaire advocated enlightened absolutism, strong central authority guided by rational principles, protecting individual rights against both mob rule and religious fanaticism, give power to intelligent, educated rulers advised by philosophers. This would produce better government than democracy, which Voltaire viewed as rule by the ignorant and passionate. Rousseau's ideal was participatory democracy among equals, though he recognized its difficulty in large, complex societies. Citizens should be involved in creating the laws they live under. This participation wasn't just about producing good policy. It was essential for human dignity and freedom. Being subject to laws imposed by others, even benevolent others, was a form of slavery. Neither man's relationship with power was hypocritical in a simple sense. Voltaire believed his approach was realistic and effective. Rousseau believed his was morally necessary despite practical difficulties. But both faced contradictions. Voltaire depended on the very aristocratic system he sometimes criticized. Rousseau needed the support of wealthy patrons while advocating for equality. The historical verdict remains mixed. Voltaire's pragmatic engagement with power produced concrete results. He saved innocent people from execution, advanced religious tolerance, and influenced actual reforms. Rousseau's radical critique inspired revolutionary movements that transformed political systems, though often through violence he would have rejected. Voltaire's relationship with religion was complex and often misunderstood. He was not an atheist, despite his reputation as religion's greatest enemy. He believed in God, specifically in a supreme being who created the universe and established natural laws. This belief came from reason rather than revelation. The order and complexity of nature seemed to require an intelligent designer. But this God was distant, not personally involved in human affairs, certainly not concerned with rituals and doctrines. What Voltaire opposed was organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church's institutional power. He saw the Church as a source of superstition, intolerance, and oppression. Throughout history, religious authorities had persecuted heretics, suppressed inquiry, and allied with tyrants. They exploited human fear and ignorance to maintain their own wealth and influence. The phrase often attributed to him, though he probably never said it exactly this way, captured his view: crush the infamous thing, meaning the institutional church. His opposition focused on specific abuses rather than faith itself. Religious persecution particularly outraged him. He spent years fighting to rehabilitate Jean Calas, a Protestant executed on false charges of murdering his son to prevent conversion to Catholicism. He took up similar cases, using his writings and connections to expose injustice committed in religion's name. These campaigns made him famous as a defender of tolerance and reason against fanaticism. Voltaire's critique of religion appeared most vividly in Candide. The novel mocked every form of religious hypocrisy and cruelty, the Inquisition torturing people for thought crimes, priests living in luxury while preaching poverty, religious wars, devastating countries over doctrinal differences. He portrayed organized religion as fundamentally at odds with human well-being and moral decency. Yet even in his mockery, Voltaire distinguished between religion as institution and religion as personal belief. He thought ordinary people needed religion to maintain moral behavior. Without belief in divine punishment and reward, what would prevent the masses from descending into chaos? This was an instrumental view, valuing religion for its social utility rather than its truth, but it showed Voltaire wasn't simply hostile to all religious sentiment. His own religiosity was minimal and philosophical. He attended church occasionally for social reasons, but found little meaning in ritual. Prayer seemed pointless if God was remote and uninvolved in daily affairs. The proper response to the divine was to study nature, live morally, and use reason to understand the world. Religious emotion, the kind of personal connection to God that many believers experienced, was foreign to his temperament. Rousseau's approach to religion couldn't have been more different. He rejected institutional Christianity as firmly as Voltaire did, but for different reasons. The church was corrupt and hypocritical, yes, but the deeper problem was that organized religion came between the individual and God. Priests, doctrines, rituals, these were human inventions that obscured rather than revealed religious truth. What mattered was direct personal religious feeling. In The Profession of Faith of a Savoyard Vicar, a section of Emile, Rousseau described his vision of natural religion. God exists and can be known through inner feeling and contemplation of nature. The divine speaks directly to the human heart. No intermediary is necessary. No complex theology is required. Religious truth is available to anyone who looks within themselves with sincerity. This emphasis on feeling over reason put Rousseau at odds with much Enlightenment thought. Voltaire and other philosophers valued reason as the path to truth. Rousseau insisted that some truths, particularly religious and moral ones, were known through sentiment rather than rational analysis. The heart had its own form of knowledge that reason couldn't access or judge. Rousseau's God was personal and morally involved. Unlike Voltaire's remote designer, Rousseau's deity cared about human goodness and suffering. Prayer made sense in this framework because God listened and responded, if not always in obvious ways. Religious feeling wasn't superstition, but a legitimate form of knowledge and connection. This view got Rousseau into trouble with both religious authorities and fellow philosophers. The Catholic Church condemned Emile for its unorthodox theology. Protestant Geneva burned it publicly. Religious authorities recognized that Rousseau's natural religion undermined their institutional claims to mediate divine truth. If anyone could know God directly through inner feeling, what need for churches, priests, and doctrines? The philosophers were equally skeptical. Rousseau's emphasis on feeling seemed irrational and dangerous. How could personal sentiment be a reliable guide to truth? Different people felt different things. Without reason as an objective standard, religion became purely subjective. Voltaire saw Rousseau's natural religion as barely distinguishable from enthusiasm and fanaticism. Their exchange about the Lisbon earthquake revealed these differences sharply. Voltaire's poem questioned divine providence. If God was good and powerful, why did thousands die in an earthquake? The event seemed to contradict any belief in a benevolent deity concerned with human welfare. Voltaire didn't draw atheistic conclusions but highlighted the problem of evil as a challenge to traditional religious belief. Rousseau responded with a long letter defending providence. The earthquake wasn't God's fault, but resulted from natural laws and human choices. God had created the best possible world, given the constraints of physical nature. Humans made things worse by building fragile cities in earthquake zones. The suffering was terrible, but didn't negate divine goodness. This defense combined rational argument with an underlying faith that God's purposes transcended human understanding. Voltaire found this response unconvincing and somewhat irritating. It seemed to excuse obvious evil through philosophical wordplay. More fundamentally, it showed Rousseau's willingness to prioritize feeling and faith over clear-eyed assessment of reality. Voltaire's skepticism wouldn't permit such leaps. The practical implications of their religious views differed significantly. Voltaire's deism led him to advocate religious tolerance. If doctrinal differences were ultimately human inventions surrounding a simple rational core belief in God, then persecuting people over these differences was absurd and criminal. Let people worship as they chose within limits of public order. This tolerance was pragmatic rather than based on deep respect for diverse religious experience. Rousseau's natural religion also implied tolerance, but for different reasons. Since true religion was a matter of inner feeling rather than external doctrine, forcing religious conformity was both impossible and wrong. Each person must find their own connection to the divine. This view gave religious freedom a deeper foundation in individual autonomy and authentic experience. Neither man was conventionally religious. Both rejected institutional Christianity's claims to exclusive truth and divine authority. But where Voltaire replaced traditional religion with philosophical deism and moral rationality, Rousseau sought to recover or reimagine religious experience on personal terms. Voltaire thought religion needed to be tamed by reason. Rousseau thought reason needed to acknowledge its limits before religious feeling. Their influence on religious thought reflected these differences. Voltaire contributed to secularization, the declining authority of religious institutions in public life. His critiques helped create space for religious pluralism and eventually for purely secular moral and political philosophy. Rousseau influenced romantic and experiential approaches to religion, the emphasis on personal spiritual experience over doctrine and institution that characterizes much modern religiosity. On November 1st, 1755, a massive earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal. The initial shock destroyed much of the city. Fires broke out across the ruins. Then a tsunami, generated by the undersea earthquake, swept through the harbor and lower city. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 30 and 60,000 people died. It was one of the worst natural disasters in European history. The earthquake's timing amplified its impact on European consciousness. November 1st was All Saints' Day, a major Catholic holy day. Churches were full when buildings collapsed. The destruction of so many people at prayer in a deeply Catholic city raised disturbing theological questions. If God was good, omnipotent, and concerned with human affairs, why did this happen? News of the disaster spread through Europe over the following weeks. The scale of destruction shocked a continent that had experienced relatively few such catastrophes in recent memory. Lisbon was a major city, wealthy and cultured, not some remote outpost. The earthquake demonstrated nature's power to destroy human achievement, regardless of civilization's progress. Voltaire responded with a poem published in 1756. The poem on the Lisbon disaster confronted the theological problem directly. He described the suffering: children buried in rubble, people burned alive, mothers clutching dead infants. Then he asked whether this was really the best of all possible worlds, whether divine providence really governed events for good. The poem targeted optimistic philosophy, particularly Leibniz's argument that this world, despite its evils, was the best possible creation. How could one look at Lisbon's ruins and maintain such optimism? What possible greater good justified such suffering? Voltaire didn't offer answers. Instead, he insisted on facing reality honestly, rather than hiding behind philosophical abstractions. The poem's tone was one of anguished questioning rather than confident atheism. Voltaire still believed in God but couldn't reconcile that belief with the evidence of Lisbon. He ended with a humble admission of ignorance. Perhaps God had reasons humans couldn't understand, perhaps not, but pretending to have answers when faced with such catastrophe was dishonest. This wasn't just an abstract philosophical exercise. Voltaire was genuinely disturbed by the earthquake and what it revealed about existence. The poem expressed his own struggle with theodicy, the attempt to justify God's goodness in a world containing evil. He found the traditional answers inadequate and said so publicly. Rousseau read the poem and was troubled for different reasons. He saw Voltaire's questioning of providence as dangerous and destructive. More importantly, he thought Voltaire had drawn the wrong conclusions from Lisbon. In August 1756, Rousseau sent Voltaire a long letter responding to the poem. The letter defended divine providence. God had not caused the earthquake directly. Natural laws governed physical processes, and earthquakes were inevitable consequences of those laws. God couldn't create a physical universe without such events. The alternative would be constant miraculous intervention, which would undermine the natural order that made life possible. Moreover, Rousseau argued, human choices had made things worse. Lisbon's buildings were poorly constructed and too densely packed. People chose to live in a city on known fault lines. They built churches where crowds gathered, creating death traps when buildings collapsed. The disaster's scope was partly human fault, not divine intention. Rousseau went further, suggesting that perhaps death in such disasters wasn't the worst evil. Those who died were spared potential future suffering. Those who survived might learn important lessons about life's fragility and the need to live virtuously. Providence worked in ways humans couldn't fully comprehend, but that didn't mean it wasn't real and good. The letter also criticized Voltaire personally. Rousseau suggested that Voltaire's comfortable life in a fine house made it easy for him to question divine goodness. A poor person living simply had less to lose and might maintain faith more easily. This was a pointed comment, implying that Voltaire's prosperity had corrupted his judgment about what mattered. Voltaire received the letter and reportedly remarked that Rousseau was trying to make him want to walk on all fours. He didn't find the arguments convincing. Human culpability for poor construction didn't address the fundamental question. Why did God create a world where such disasters were possible? The suggestion that death might be a blessing to victims seemed like tortured rationalization. More fundamentally, Voltaire saw Rousseau's defense of providence as motivated by sentiment rather than reason. Rousseau wanted to believe in a good God, so he constructed arguments to support that belief regardless of evidence. This was exactly the kind of thinking Voltaire opposed, letting desire determine conclusions rather than following evidence where it led. Rousseau, in turn, thought Voltaire's skepticism reflected a cold heart unable to feel the deeper truth of divine goodness. Reason alone couldn't grasp religious truth. Voltaire's insistence on rational proof for providence showed his limitations as a thinker, his inability to access knowledge that came through feeling and faith. The debate extended beyond the letters themselves. Voltaire incorporated his response into Candide, published in 1759. The novel savagely mocked optimism through the character of Pangloss, who insisted this was the best of all possible worlds, even as characters suffered every imaginable misfortune. The Lisbon earthquake appeared in the story, demonstrating the absurdity of optimistic philosophy in the face of real catastrophe. Candide's conclusion that we must cultivate our garden represented Voltaire's practical response to the problem of evil. Don't waste time trying to justify suffering philosophically. Don't pretend to understand God's purposes. Instead, focus on improving the small corner of the world within your control. Do what you can to reduce suffering and increase happiness. Accept that larger questions may have no answers. Rousseau never wrote a systematic response to Candide, but the novel deepened his resentment of Voltaire. He saw it as mockery not just of philosophical optimism, but of faith itself. The character Pangloss might be aimed at Leibniz, but Rousseau felt implicated in the satire. His defense of providence was being ridiculed before all Europe. The earthquake debate revealed core differences in how the two men approached fundamental questions. Voltaire demanded that philosophy face reality honestly, even when that meant accepting uncertainty and abandoning comforting beliefs. Rousseau insisted that some truths transcended rational demonstration and required faith. Both were responding to genuine human suffering, but they drew opposite conclusions about how to think and feel about it. The historical significance of their exchange extended beyond the specific theological question. It highlighted tensions within Enlightenment thought between reason and feeling, between skeptical inquiry and moral certainty, between accepting the world as it is and believing it should be better. These tensions would continue to shape Western intellectual life long after both men were dead. In 1733, Voltaire began a relationship with Émilie du Châtelet that would last 15 years until her death. She was a brilliant mathematician and physicist, one of the few women of her era to achieve serious scholarly recognition. She translated Newton's Principia into French and added her own mathematical commentary. Voltaire lived with her at her chateau at Cirey, where they worked side by side on scientific and philosophical projects. The relationship was both intellectual and romantic, though its precise nature changed over time. They collaborated on research, discussed ideas as equals, and supported each other's work. Voltaire treated du Châtelet as an intellectual peer, something extremely rare for the period. He valued her judgment and often sought her opinion on his writings. This partnership shaped Voltaire's life in fundamental ways. The years at Cirey were among his most productive. Du Châtelet provided not just companionship, but intellectual stimulation and practical support. She managed the estate, dealt with publishers, and created an environment where Voltaire could work without distraction. When she died in childbirth in 1749, he was devastated. Voltaire never married and had no children. His relationship with du Châtelet represented his deepest personal connection, and he never fully replaced it after her death. He had other friendships and possibly other romantic involvements, but nothing comparable in significance. His later years were spent in productive solitude, focused on work rather than intimate relationships. This pattern reflected Voltaire's practical approach to personal life. He valued companionship that enhanced rather than complicated his work. He avoided the kinds of dramatic emotional entanglements that might distract from intellectual pursuits. His relationship with du Châtelet worked because it combined emotional connection with shared purpose. When circumstances didn't permit such ideal arrangement, he preferred independence. Rousseau's personal life followed a completely different and far more troubled pattern. In 1745, he began living with Thérèse Levasseur, a laundress at his boarding house. She was uneducated, probably illiterate, and by most accounts not intellectually compatible with him. Yet the relationship lasted, with interruptions, for the rest of Rousseau's life. He eventually married her in 1768. Between approximately 1746 and 1751, Thérèse gave birth to 5 children. Rousseau arranged for all of them to be sent to a foundling hospital, where they were raised by the state. Most children placed in such institutions died young. Rousseau certainly knew this. He effectively condemned his own children to probable death rather than raise them. This act became the greatest scandal of Rousseau's life once it became public knowledge. He disclosed it himself in his Confessions, written late in life. He tried to justify the decision with various arguments. He couldn't afford children. Thérèse's family was difficult and would have raised them badly. The children would be better off as workers than as sons of a struggling writer. None of these explanations were convincing then or now. The contradiction between Rousseau's public positions and his private action was profound and obvious. He wrote Émile, one of history's most influential treatises on education and child-rearing. He emphasized the importance of a father's involvement in children's lives. He criticized the aristocratic practice of sending children to wet nurses, yet he abandoned his own children to institutions. Rousseau's defenders have pointed out that giving children to foundling hospitals, while terrible, wasn't uncommon among the poor in 18th century Paris. This is true, but doesn't explain why Rousseau, who wasn't desperately poor by the 1750s when he was making these decisions, continued the practice. It also doesn't address why someone who claimed to value authentic living over social convention followed such a convention when it violated his stated principles. His own later reflections on these decisions show awareness of their wrongness. In the Confessions, he describes feeling tormented by guilt. He admits he acted badly and tries to explain rather than justify his behavior. But he never fully took responsibility in a way that acknowledged the enormity of what he had done to those children. The relationship with Thérèse itself raised questions. Rousseau claimed to love her, but also described her as simple-minded and unsuitable for intellectual conversation. He He kept their relationship secret for years, apparently embarrassed by her low social status and lack of education. This secrecy contradicted his rhetoric about authentic living free from concern for social opinion. In his writings, Rousseau idealized romantic love as a pure, ennobling emotion. He described love as central to human happiness and moral development. His novel Julie, or The New Eloise, presented passionate, virtuous love as life's highest experience. Yet his actual relationship seemed based more on convenience and habit than on the exalted connection his writings described. Voltaire's more pragmatic approach to personal relationships appeared more honest, if less inspiring. He didn't pretend to live according to ideals he couldn't maintain. His relationship with Du Châtelet was based on mutual respect, shared interests, and genuine affection. It worked on its own terms without claiming to exemplify universal truths about love. The contrast extends to their views on sexuality and morality more generally. Voltaire was relatively libertine in his attitudes, skeptical of sexual prohibitions that didn't serve clear social purposes. He saw no moral problem with consensual relationships between adults, married or not, as long as they didn't involve deception or harm. His plays and stories often included sexual intrigue without moralizing condemnation. Rousseau's published views on sexuality were more conservative despite his irregular personal life. He emphasized the importance of sexual restraint, the connection between sexuality and morality, and the degrading effects of libertinism. Julie presents virtue as requiring control of sexual passion. Émile's education includes strict limits on sexual awareness and expression until appropriate age and circumstances. This conservatism reflected Rousseau's view that sexuality was powerful and potentially corrupting if not properly channeled. Unlike physical needs like hunger, sexual desire had psychological and social dimensions that made it morally significant. How people handled sexuality affected their character and their relationships with others. The gap between Rousseau's ideals and his practice troubled his contemporaries and has troubled readers ever since. Some see it as simple hypocrisy, evidence that his philosophy was fraudulent. Others view it as tragic, showing how even someone who understood authentic living might fail to achieve it. Still others suggest that Rousseau's very failures informed his philosophy, that his awareness of his own weakness shaped his understanding of human nature. Voltaire occasionally mocked Rousseau's contradictions, particularly after their relationship had soured, but he didn't make personal scandal the focus of his criticism. His attacks concentrated on Rousseau's ideas rather than his private failings. This might have been tactical, given that Voltaire's own life provided material for counterattack, but it also reflected his view that ideas should be judged on their merits rather than by the character of those who proposed them. The question of how much personal behavior should affect evaluation of someone's ideas remains unresolved. Rousseau's abandonment of his children doesn't necessarily invalidate his educational philosophy, but it certainly complicates it. His troubled relationship with Thérèse doesn't prove his ideas about love were wrong, but it raises questions about their basis in actual experience versus imagination. In 1758, Jean Laurent d'Alembert published an article in the Encyclopedia suggesting that Geneva should allow theater performances. The city had banned theater as morally corrupting, following strict Protestant traditions. D'Alembert argued that this prohibition was excessive and that Geneva would benefit culturally from permitting dramatic performances under proper regulation. Rousseau, who had left Geneva years earlier but still identified as Genevan, responded with a long letter that became a published essay, Letter to Monsieur d'Alembert on the Theater. The response was passionate and uncompromising. Rousseau argued that theater was fundamentally incompatible with republican virtue and that Geneva was right to ban it. The argument wasn't about censorship in general or even about particular plays being immoral. Rousseau's critique was more fundamental. Theater, he claimed, corrupted both performers and audiences. It taught people to value appearance over reality, to admire clever deception, to enjoy representations of vice. Even when plays depicted virtue, they did so in ways that made virtue theatrical, something to perform rather than actually practice. Actors particularly troubled Rousseau. Their profession required them to assume false identities, to feel emotions they didn't genuinely experience, to deceive audiences into accepting illusion as reality. This made acting inherently corrupting. An actor who regularly pretended to be other people, feeling fake emotions and speaking scripted words, couldn't maintain authentic connection to their own identity. The effects on audiences were equally damaging. People who attended theater regularly learned to value performance and eloquence over sincerity and truth. They brought this attitude back into daily life, treating social interaction as performance. Theater encouraged precisely the artificiality and disconnect from authentic self that Rousseau saw as civilization's curse. Rousseau distinguished between different types of theater. Ancient Greek tragedy, performed in specific civic contexts, might have served genuine moral and political purposes. But modern commercial theater, performed for entertainment and profit, was different. It flattered audiences, reinforced social prejudices, and provided escape from reality rather than insight into it. He also noted that theater's effects depended on context. In large corrupt cities like Paris, theater might be relatively harmless because the population was already thoroughly corrupted. Adding theater to the mix changed little. But in small, virtuous republics like Geneva, introducing theater would begin a process of moral decay. It would create taste for sophistication and artifice that would eventually undermine civic virtue. The letter attacked the encyclopedists, D'Alembert's intellectual circle that included Voltaire. Rousseau accused them of wanting to corrupt Geneva out of philosophical principle, to prove that their cosmopolitan values were superior to traditional republican virtue. This was personal as well as philosophical, marking Rousseau's definitive break with the philosophes. Voltaire was outraged. He loved theater and had written numerous plays throughout his career. Theater wasn't frivolous entertainment, but one of civilization's great achievements. Drama could teach moral lessons, challenge prejudice, and provide models of virtuous behavior. Greek tragedy, which Rousseau partially exempted, proved that theater could serve serious moral and political purposes. More fundamentally, Voltaire saw Rousseau's attack as part of his broader hostility to civilization itself. Theater required sophisticated society to support it: writers, actors, audiences with education and leisure, cities large enough to sustain permanent companies. Opposing theater meant opposing the cultural development that made such things possible. Voltaire's plays embodied his values. They were witty, sophisticated, and often dealt with serious themes through elegant dialogue and clever plotting. They assumed educated audiences capable of appreciating literary and philosophical references. They celebrated refined culture and rational discourse, everything Rousseau opposed. The practical implications of their disagreement went beyond whether Geneva should have a theater. It touched on the purposes of art more generally. For Rousseau, art should emerge from authentic feeling and serve moral development. Simplicity and sincerity mattered more than technical skill or sophistication. Folk songs and simple entertainments rooted in community life were preferable to professional performances. For Voltaire, art represented human achievement worth cultivating for its own sake. Technical excellence, aesthetic refinement, and sophisticated execution were valuable. Art should challenge, provoke, and elevate. Professional artists who dedicated themselves to their craft produced work superior to amateur efforts, however sincere. Their different views on theater reflected their different conceptions of education. Rousseau believed education should develop natural capacities and authentic self-expression. Exposing children to theater taught them to value performance over sincerity, to admire artificial eloquence over honest speech. It corrupted natural development. Voltaire thought education should transmit culture and develop aesthetic judgment. Attending well-crafted plays taught appreciation for literary skill, moral complexity, and human psychology. It refined taste and broadened perspective. Denying children exposure to theater left them provincial and unsophisticated. The gender dimensions of the theater debate were significant, though not always explicit. Theater provided one of the few professional paths for women in 18th century society. Actresses could achieve fame, wealth, and a degree of independence unusual for women of the period. Rousseau's opposition to theater implicitly opposed this avenue of female advancement. Voltaire had worked with many actresses and respected their abilities. His long relationship with Émilie du Châtelet, though she wasn't an actress, showed his willingness to treat talented women as intellectual equals. Theater's provision of opportunities for women might have been another reason he valued it. Rousseau's views on women, particularly his belief that women should focus on domestic roles rather than public life, aligned with his opposition to theater. Women on stage violated his sense of proper female modesty and appropriate gender roles. The theater world's relative gender equality was another sign of its moral corruption. The philosophical disagreement about theater never resolved. Rousseau remained convinced that dramatic performance was inherently corrupting. Voltaire continued to write and promote plays until late in his life. Geneva maintained its theatrical prohibition, though it eventually permitted performances after both men were dead. Modern readers might find the intensity of this debate puzzling. Theater seems too minor to justify such passionate disagreement. But for Rousseau and Voltaire, the question of theater concentrated larger arguments about civilization, authenticity, morality, and human nature. Their positions on drama reflected their entire philosophical systems. In 1762, Rousseau published Émile, or On Education. The book presented his vision for raising a child from birth through young adulthood. It wasn't a practical manual for parents, but a philosophical treatise using education to explore human nature and proper social development. The work became enormously influential, shaping educational theory for generations. Émile's core principle was that children possess natural goodness that should be preserved rather than corrupted by conventional education. The tutor's job wasn't to impose knowledge or values, but to create conditions where the child's innate capacities could develop properly. This meant isolating the child from society's corrupting influences, especially in early years. The educational program Rousseau described was radically child-centered. The tutor should observe the child's natural interests and developmental stages, introducing experiences and knowledge when the child was ready to receive them. Forcing premature learning damaged natural development. A child should learn to read only when genuinely curious about written material, not because a curriculum dictated it. Physical education took priority in early years. Émile learned through direct experience with nature, walking, climbing, working with his hands, experiencing heat and cold, hunger and satisfaction. These physical experiences taught him about reality without verbal instruction or books. He developed strength, practical skills, and understanding of natural limits. Moral education came through natural consequences rather than rules imposed by authority. If Émile broke something, he experienced the loss. If he lied, he discovered that people stopped trusting him. The tutor arranged situations where actions had natural results, allowing Émile to learn from experience rather than lecture. This taught genuine understanding of why behaviors were right or wrong. Crucially, Émile learned a trade. Rousseau insisted that everyone should have practical skills to support themselves. This preserved independence and prevented the corruption that came from depending on others. Even if Émile never needed to work manually, knowing he could supported psychological freedom and self-respect. Religious education was delayed until Émile reached adolescence and could think abstractly. Then the tutor presented natural religion, the kind Rousseau himself believed in, emphasizing feeling and conscience over doctrine. Émile would develop personal faith rather than accepting prescribed beliefs. This section got Rousseau condemned by both Catholic and Protestant authorities. The final section dealt with Émile's marriage to Sophie, a young woman raised according to different principles. Here Rousseau's views on gender became explicit and troubling. Sophie's education focused on pleasing men, managing households, and supporting her husband. Where Émile learned independence and self-reliance, Sophie learned dependence and subordination. This contradiction in Émile has troubled readers ever since. If natural education preserves human goodness and develops freedom, why do girls need different education that prepares them for subordinate roles? Rousseau argued that men and women had different natural functions requiring different preparation. Few modern readers find this convincing. Voltaire read Émile with increasing irritation. The entire project seemed impractical and based on false premises. Children weren't naturally good beings corrupted by society. They were naturally selfish and ignorant beings who needed civilization to become moral and knowledgeable. Education should transmit culture, not preserve some imaginary natural innocence. The idea of isolating a child from society struck Voltaire as absurd. Humans were social creatures who needed to learn social skills. Protecting Émile from exposure to other people's influence left him unprepared for actual life. The moment Émile entered society, which he eventually had to do, his protected natural goodness would prove inadequate for navigating real social situations. Voltaire also questioned the practical feasibility of Rousseau's plan. It required a tutor dedicating entire attention to one child for years. Only the wealthy could afford such arrangement. Yet Rousseau's rhetoric suggested his method was universally applicable and superior to conventional education available to ordinary families. This was elitist, while pretending to be egalitarian. The learning through experience approach seemed inefficient to Voltaire. Children could learn much faster through instruction than through discovering everything themselves. Civilization had accumulated knowledge over generations. Education should transmit this inheritance efficiently, not make each child rediscover basic truths through trial and error. Voltaire valued traditional educational content that Rousseau downplayed: classical literature, history, languages, mathematics, philosophy. These subjects developed the mind and connected students to cultural heritage. Rousseau's emphasis on practical skills and natural experience seemed to produce an educated savage rather than a cultivated person. The religious section particularly troubled Voltaire, not because he disagreed with Rousseau's natural religion, which was similar to his own deism, but because Rousseau presented it as suitable for universal education. Most people needed traditional religion for moral guidance. Teaching them to rely on inner feeling would remove necessary social controls. Despite disagreeing with almost everything in Émile, Voltaire recognized the book's power and importance. It challenged educational assumptions, raised fundamental questions about human nature and social development, and was beautifully written. He might think it was dangerous nonsense, but it was influential, dangerous nonsense that demanded response. Voltaire never wrote a systematic educational treatise comparable to Émile. His views on education appeared scattered through his writings and correspondence, but the overall picture was clear. Education should be rigorous, culturally focused, and designed to produce rational, cultivated adults who could function effectively in civilized society. He supported expanding educational opportunities, particularly in basic literacy and practical skills for the poor. An educated population was less susceptible to superstition and priestly manipulation, but education should respect class realities. Training a peasant's child for aristocratic life was pointless and cruel. Education should prepare people for the lives they would actually lead. This practical conservatism about education's social function contrasted sharply with Rousseau's more radical vision. Émile was being educated for genuine freedom and equality, even though Rousseau acknowledged such education was barely achievable in actual society. Voltaire accepted social hierarchy and thought education should work within it, improving people's lives without pretending to create equality. The influence of both men on educational thought has been enormous. Rousseau inspired progressive education movements emphasizing child-centered learning, developmental appropriateness, and learning by doing. His critique of rote memorization and authoritarian teaching influenced reformers for generations. The idea that education should develop individual potential rather than simply transmit information traces partly to Émile. Voltaire's influence was less direct but still significant. His emphasis on reason, clear thinking, and cultural literacy shaped liberal education ideals. The notion that educated citizens were essential for free society, that combating ignorance and superstition required schools, reflected Voltairean principles. Modern education incorporates elements from both visions. Child-centered approaches that respect developmental stages echo Rousseau. Emphasis on cultural literacy and rigorous academic content reflects Voltaire. The tension between these approaches, between respecting natural development and transmitting cultural heritage, between student interest and academic structure, continues to shape educational debates. Neither man's educational vision was fully consistent or entirely practical. Rousseau's Émile required impossible conditions and contained internal contradictions, particularly regarding gender. Voltaire's acceptance of educational inequality fit his historical context, but offends modern sensibilities. Both grappled with fundamental questions about education's purposes and methods that remain unresolved. Voltaire was born into comfortable circumstances, but not great wealth. His father's income as a notary provided security but not luxury. When Voltaire chose writing over law, he gave up a guaranteed professional income. Yet by middle age, he had become one of the wealthiest writers in Europe. He achieved this through shrewdness, careful planning, and willingness to engage in business alongside literary work. His first significant money came from a lottery scheme in 1729. The French government had established a lottery to pay off government bonds, but the system was poorly designed. Voltaire and a mathematician friend realized they could guarantee profit by buying enough tickets to ensure wins. They did this systematically, making substantial money before authorities closed the loophole. This incident revealed Voltaire's financial intelligence and his comfort with exploiting opportunities others missed. He wasn't gambling or taking risks. He had calculated that the system's design made profit certain if one had enough capital to buy sufficient tickets. It was arbitrage, not luck. He invested his earnings carefully. He bought government bonds when prices were low, sold when they rose. He invested in commercial ventures, including supplying the French army. He lent money at interest. He purchased real estate. By the time he was 50, he had enough wealth to live independently of aristocratic patronage, though he continued to accept gifts and payments. This financial independence mattered enormously to Voltaire. It allowed him to write what he wanted without worrying about offending patrons. When he quarreled with Frederick the Great and left Prussia, he could afford to do so. When French authorities tried to suppress his works, he could publish from Switzerland or Holland without starving. Money was freedom. His estate at Ferney, purchased in 1758, demonstrated how he used wealth. The property straddled the French-Swiss border, allowing him to cross to safety if either country's authorities came after him. He developed the estate systematically, building workshops, establishing a watchmaking industry, improving agricultural production. It wasn't just a residence, but a commercial operation. Voltaire was generous with his money when it served purposes he valued. He supported younger writers, funded legal campaigns for victims of injustice, and helped develop his region economically. But this generosity was strategic, directed towards specific ends. He saw no virtue in poverty or in giving money away without purpose. His attitude toward wealth was thoroughly practical. Money was a tool for achieving independence, comfort, and influence, making it required intelligence and effort, which he was willing to provide. There was nothing shameful about being wealthy if wealth was earned through legitimate means and used wisely. Rousseau's relationship with money was completely different and far more troubled. He earned income at various points through music copying, tutoring, and secretarial work. His writings eventually brought fame but less money than Voltaire's. More importantly, he repeatedly rejected opportunities for financial security out of principle. In 1752, after the success of his discourse on the arts and sciences and his opera The Village Soothsayer, Rousseau was offered a royal pension. This would have guaranteed comfortable income for life. He refused it. Accepting money from the king would create obligation and compromise his independence. He preferred poverty to dependence on royal favor. Several wealthy patrons offered Rousseau places to live and financial support. Sometimes he accepted temporarily, but these arrangements usually ended badly. Rousseau found the obligations intolerable. Even when patrons demanded nothing explicit, he felt the implicit expectation of gratitude and deference. He couldn't write or think freely while dependent on someone else's generosity. His solution was to support himself through manual labor, specifically copying music by hand. This work was tedious and poorly paid, but it had advantages Rousseau valued. It was honest labor that didn't create obligation to anyone. He could take as much work as he needed and refuse it when he didn't. No one controlled him through financial dependence. This choice kept Rousseau poor most of his life. He lived in cheap accommodations, dressed simply, and lacked money for comforts Voltaire took for granted. But he maintained what he considered moral independence. He wasn't anyone's client or dependent. He could criticize the powerful without being accused of biting the hand that fed him. Rousseau's writings celebrated this independence even when his personal practice faltered. The social contract envisions a society of roughly equal citizens where no one depends on another's arbitrary will. Economic independence underlies political freedom. Someone who needs another person's favor to survive cannot be truly free or truly virtuous. This position reflected Rousseau's personal experience of dependence and his hatred of the psychological costs it imposed. When he worked as a secretary to wealthy patrons, he felt their superiority constantly. Even kind treatment felt humiliating because it emphasized the power imbalance. Economic equality wasn't just about material distribution, but about preserving human dignity. Voltaire found this attitude absurd. Rousseau refused wealth that would have let him live comfortably, then complained about poverty. He rejected opportunities for security out of pride, then resented the insecurity his choices created. The whole performance seemed like theatrical self-pity designed to demonstrate moral superiority. More fundamentally, Voltaire thought Rousseau misunderstood the relationship between money and freedom. Wealth properly managed enhanced independence rather than compromising it. Voltaire's investments freed him from depending on anyone. He could afford to offend kings because he didn't need their patronage. Rousseau's poverty made him dependent on whoever would house him, constraining his choices far more than accepting a pension would have. The moral status of wealth itself divided them. Rousseau saw accumulation as corrupting. Wanting more than one needed reflected amour propre, the competitive self-love that poisoned human relations. Economic inequality created social hierarchy and political domination. A good society required rough economic equality alongside political equality. Voltaire accepted economic inequality as natural and beneficial. Some people were more talented, harder working, or luckier. They would accumulate more wealth. This was fine as long as they earned it legitimately, and the poor had basic security. Inequality in itself wasn't unjust. It provided incentives for effort and rewarded merit. Their different attitudes toward money reflected different conceptions of virtue. For Rousseau, virtue required not just acting rightly, but maintaining proper internal disposition. Being dependent, even on a generous patron, corrupted this disposition. It made one calculate how to please the patron, compromising authenticity. Poverty freely chosen preserved moral integrity. For Voltaire, virtue was about action and outcome, not internal purity. If wealth allowed one to do more good, to support worthy causes, to live rationally and pleasurably, then acquiring and using wealth was virtuous. Internal disposition mattered less than concrete results. Rousseau's poverty helped no one and struck Voltaire as pointless asceticism. The practical implications extended to their political recommendations. Rousseau's egalitarianism suggested limits on accumulation and mechanisms to prevent extreme inequality. His ideal republic in the social contract included sumptuary laws limiting luxury and measures to prevent wealth concentration. Economic equality supported political equality. Voltaire's liberalism protected property rights and commercial freedom. Government should prevent theft and fraud, but otherwise let people make money as they could. economic freedom was part of general freedom. Restricting commerce and accumulation reduced liberty and prosperity. A wealthy society could afford to educate people and support the arts. Neither man was entirely consistent. Rousseau accepted financial help when desperate, despite his principles. Voltaire sometimes criticized luxury and excessive wealth accumulation despite defending economic freedom. But their overall positions remained opposed. Rousseau seeing money as corrupting and dangerous, Voltaire seeing it as a neutral tool to be used wisely. The historical influence of their views is complex. Rousseau inspired socialist and egalitarian movements emphasizing economic justice and limits on inequality. His critique of luxury and accumulation resonated with movements seeking economic redistribution. Voltaire's defense of commercial freedom and property rights influenced liberal economics and capitalism. Modern debates about economic inequality, wealth taxation, universal basic income, and the relationship between economic and political freedom echo this 18th century argument. Should society limit accumulation to preserve equality and prevent domination? Or should economic freedom be protected as essential liberty? The question Rousseau and Voltaire debated remains unresolved. Voltaire's intellectual life was deeply shaped by science, particularly Newtonian physics. In the 1730s, working with Émile du Châtelet, he helped introduce Newton's ideas to French audiences still attached to Cartesian physics. He wrote elements of Newton's philosophy, explaining key concepts in accessible French. He saw this work as crucial to Enlightenment progress. Newton represented everything Voltaire admired about human intellectual achievement. Through observation, mathematics, and rigorous reasoning, Newton had discovered fundamental laws governing the universe. He had replaced speculation and authority with empirical investigation and rational analysis. This was precisely what needed to happen in all areas of human thought. The method mattered as much as specific discoveries. Newton showed how to gain genuine knowledge, observe phenomena carefully, formulate hypotheses, test them against evidence, accept conclusions even when they contradicted intuition or received wisdom. This approach could be applied beyond physics to moral questions, political organization, and religious belief. Voltaire promoted scientific thinking throughout his writings. He celebrated medical advances that saved lives, astronomical discoveries that revealed the universe's vastness, chemical experiments that explained natural processes. Each advance demonstrated human capability for understanding and controlling nature through reason. This progress justified optimism about humanity's future. The practical benefits of science particularly impressed Voltaire. Smallpox inoculation, which he championed, prevented a disease that killed or disfigured thousands. Better understanding of agriculture increased food production. Improvements in navigation enabled commerce and exploration. Science directly improved human welfare in measurable ways. He also valued science's challenge to religious authority. When observation showed Earth orbited the Sun, not vice versa, it demonstrated that scripture and church tradition could be wrong about physical reality. If religious authorities were wrong about astronomy, perhaps they were wrong about other things. Science empowered people to check claims against evidence rather than accepting authority. This didn't mean Voltaire believed science could answer all questions. Moral and aesthetic judgments required different faculties than scientific investigation. But he thought scientific methods' emphasis on evidence and reason should inform all thinking. Superstition and blind faith should yield to observation and logic wherever possible. Rousseau's view of science was far more ambiguous. He didn't deny science's discoveries or claim that scientific knowledge was false. His argument was more subtle. Scientific progress, whatever its intellectual merits, had harmful social and moral consequences. The advance of knowledge hadn't made people happier, more virtuous, or more free. His first discourse developed this argument in detail. As arts and sciences progressed, societies became more corrupt. Ancient Rome was most virtuous when its people were simple farmers and soldiers, least virtuous at the height of its cultural and intellectual sophistication. Modern Europe showed the same pattern. The most scientifically advanced societies showed the worst moral corruption. Rousseau proposed several mechanisms for this correlation. Scientific progress required and reinforced social inequality. Sustained scientific work needed wealth and leisure, which required some people to work so others could think. The division between intellectual and manual labor created hierarchy and dependence. Scientists became an elite class, separated from ordinary people. Scientific knowledge also increased human desires without increasing genuine satisfaction. Each discovery suggested new possibilities, new things to want, new sources of dissatisfaction with current conditions. The person who knew only their immediate environment could be content with what they had. The person aware of scientific advances always wanted more. Moreover, science alienated people from direct experience. Instead of understanding their world through immediate engagement, people relied on abstract theories and expert knowledge. This created psychological distance from nature and from their own experience. They lost connection to reality as lived in favor of reality as described by science. Rousseau particularly objected to how scientific culture valued certain forms of intelligence over others. Theoretical ability, mathematical skill, and abstract reasoning received honor and reward. Practical wisdom, moral judgment, and emotional intelligence were devalued. This created a perverse hierarchy where the cleverest person wasn't necessarily the wisest or best. The social dynamics of scientific communities troubled him as well. Scientists competed for recognition, priority in discovery, and positions in academies. This competition bred dishonesty, jealousy, and careerist thinking. Pure love of truth got corrupted by desire for reputation. Science as actually practiced fell short of its idealized self-image. Rousseau wasn't advocating for ignorance or rejection of all knowledge. His point was that knowledge divorced from virtue was dangerous, that intellectual progress without moral progress created powerful tools in the hands of corrupt people. Science should serve human well-being, but too often it served pride, vanity, and domination. The Lisbon earthquake debate touched on these different attitudes towards science. Voltaire's poem implicitly relied on scientific understanding of earthquakes as natural phenomena governed by physical laws. This scientific view made the disaster seem purposeless, challenging religious explanations. Science's truthfulness demanded accepting reality even when uncomfortable. Rousseau's response suggested that scientific explanation, while perhaps accurate, missed something important. Knowing an earthquake's physical causes didn't address its meaning or how people should respond emotionally and morally. Scientific understanding could coexist with religious faith and moral interpretation. One didn't need to choose between scientific truth and spiritual truth. Their disagreement reflected different views on what counted as knowledge. Voltaire privileged empirical, verifiable knowledge gained through scientific method. This was the model for all genuine understanding. Other forms of supposed knowledge, those based on feeling or tradition, were suspect unless confirmed by evidence and reason. Rousseau defended multiple forms of knowledge. Scientific understanding was valid in its domain, but moral truth came through conscience, religious truth through inner feeling, social wisdom through experience. Science couldn't answer every important question. Treating it as the only legitimate knowledge impoverished human understanding. The gender dimensions of scientific progress rarely appeared explicitly in their debate, but mattered nonetheless. Science was an almost exclusively male domain in their era. Voltaire's collaboration with Du Châtelet was exceptional. Rousseau's arguments about science creating harmful social hierarchies didn't address how it excluded women from intellectual life. Both men would likely have said women could do science if properly educated, though Rousseau's views on women's education made such opportunity unlikely in practice. Voltaire's support for women's intellectual capacity was more genuine, but also acknowledged the barriers they faced in male-dominated scientific institutions. The practical political implications of their views on science diverged significantly. Voltaire advocated for supporting scientific institutions, academies, and research. Society should fund scientific work because it produced valuable knowledge and practical benefits. Scientists deserved honor and resources. Rousseau was skeptical of scientific institutions as sources of inequality and corruption. Money spent on academies might be better spent on other social needs. Honor given to scientists reflected and reinforced harmful values about what mattered. A good society wouldn't necessarily prioritize scientific advancement over other goods. Their different assessments shaped views on education. Voltaire wanted education to include scientific knowledge, teaching people about natural world through Newton's laws and empirical investigation. This would combat superstition and develop rational thinking. Scientific literacy was essential for enlightened citizenship. Rousseau's Émile delayed scientific education until late and subordinated it to moral development and practical skills. Émile learned about nature through direct experience before learning scientific theories. Abstract knowledge shouldn't replace concrete understanding. Science had its place but shouldn't dominate education. The long-term influence of their debate continues. Rousseau anticipated later critiques of scientism, the belief that science could answer all important questions, or that scientific progress guaranteed human betterment. His warnings about science's social consequences resonated with critics of technological society and environmental degradation. Voltaire's scientific optimism influenced the progressive belief that knowledge and technology could solve human problems. His faith in reason and evidence shaped scientific culture's self-understanding. The view that supporting science serves public good traces partly to Enlightenment advocacy by Voltaire and others. Modern tensions between scientific authority and public skepticism, between expertise and lived experience, between technological progress and its social costs, echo this 18th century argument. Should science be celebrated as liberation from ignorance or questioned as potential source of alienation? Both perspectives claim valid insights that remain difficult to reconcile. Voltaire's political thinking evolved from his experiences with power. He witnessed the French monarchy's arbitrary cruelty and censorship firsthand, spending time in the Bastille for insulting a nobleman. He saw religious authorities persecute innocent people for their beliefs. He observed how ignorant masses could be manipulated by demagogues and priests. These experiences shaped a practical rather than idealistic political philosophy. His preferred system was enlightened absolutism, strong central authority exercised by an intelligent, educated ruler guided by philosophical principles. The monarch should protect individual rights, promote religious tolerance, support arts and sciences, and govern according to reason rather than tradition or superstition. Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia represented this ideal, however imperfectly they realized it. This preference wasn't based on abstract principles about legitimate authority. Voltaire cared about outcomes more than processes. A good monarch who protected rights and promoted progress was preferable to a democratic government that persecuted minorities and suppressed freedom. The form of government mattered less than what it actually did for people's welfare and liberty. Voltaire distrusted democracy and popular rule. The common people, in his view, were too ignorant and superstitious to govern wisely. They believed whatever priests told them, followed demagogues who appealed to their prejudices, and had no understanding of complex policy questions. Giving them political power would result in mob rule, persecution of minorities, and bad governance. He pointed to historical examples: ancient Athens executing Socrates, the Roman mob destroying the Republic, religious wars driven by popular fanaticism. When ordinary people gained power, they used it badly. They were too easily manipulated, too attached to tradition, too hostile to innovation and reason. Democracy meant rule by the ignorant over the educated. This didn't mean Voltaire supported tyranny. He spent considerable effort fighting specific injustices committed by authorities. His campaigns for victims of judicial murder and religious persecution showed his commitment to limiting arbitrary power. But he sought these limits through enlightened rulers constrained by rational principles, not through popular participation. The role of law was crucial in Voltaire's thinking. Government should operate according to clear, rational laws that applied equally to everyone. No one, not even the king, should be above the law. Legal reform to eliminate irrational punishments, arbitrary arrests, and religious persecution was central to progress. But laws should be made and enforced by intelligent, educated officials, not crowds. Property rights particularly mattered to Voltaire. Individual liberty required security of property. Government shouldn't arbitrarily confiscate wealth or impose crushing taxes. Economic freedom and political freedom were linked. Protecting property encouraged enterprise and prosperity, which benefited everyone through commerce and employment. Voltaire's ideal was basically liberal monarchy, a government that protected individual rights, promoted commerce and culture, maintained order and security, but otherwise left people free to live as they chose. This required an enlightened ruler and good laws, not popular sovereignty or democratic participation. Most people weren't capable of governing. They needed to be governed well. Rousseau's political philosophy started from completely different premises. The Social Contract, published in 1762, began with perhaps the most famous sentence in political philosophy: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." The question was how political authority could be legitimate given this original freedom. Rousseau's answer was that legitimate authority came only from the general will of the people themselves. Government was justified only when citizens collectively determined the laws they would live under. Any other arrangement, including monarchy, was a form of slavery. Even if a king governed wisely and protected people's welfare, subjects remained unfree because they lived under laws they hadn't made. This wasn't democracy as simple majority rule. The general will wasn't just what most people wanted at any moment. It was what citizens would will as members of the political community, considering the common good rather than private interests. Discovering the general will required citizens to deliberate together as equals, setting aside particular desires to identify shared interests. The concept was subtle and difficult to grasp, which led to confusion and misinterpretation. Rousseau wasn't saying whatever the majority voted for was automatically right. He was describing an ideal process where genuinely equal citizens thinking as civic members would converge on common good. This might rarely be achieved in practice, but it was the standard for legitimate authority. Rousseau's ideal polity was small, direct democracy where citizens could gather to make laws collectively. Ancient Greek city-states or Geneva, in its republican moments, provided models, though imperfect ones. Large nations couldn't easily realize this ideal, which was one reason Rousseau was skeptical of progress and expansion. Smallness and simplicity enabled genuine self-government. Economic equality was necessary for political equality to work. If some citizens were vastly wealthier than others, they would dominate political decisions. If some depended on others economically, they couldn't participate as free equals. The ideal republic required rough economic equality. No one rich enough to buy another, no one poor enough to need to sell themselves. This vision directly challenged everything Voltaire stood for politically. It rejected rule by educated elites in favor of popular sovereignty. It demanded economic leveling rather than protecting property rights. It valued political participation over efficient administration. It made legitimacy depend on process rather than outcomes. Voltaire would have found Rousseau's ideal laughably impractical. How could thousands or millions of people deliberate collectively? How would complex policy decisions get made? What happened when citizens disagreed about the common good? The whole scheme ignored human nature's realities and government's practical requirements. More dangerously, Voltaire saw in Rousseau's ideas the seeds of tyranny. If the general will represented absolute sovereign authority, what protected minorities or dissenters? If society could legitimately enforce conformity to the general will, wasn't this more oppressive than enlightened monarchy? Rousseau's emphasis on unity and the common good threatened individual liberty. Rousseau would respond that Voltaire's enlightened absolutism was slavery with good manners. However well-intentioned the monarch, subjects remained fundamentally unfree. They lived under laws they hadn't made, dependent on the ruler's wisdom and benevolence. This wasn't true freedom, which required self-government. The role of representation divided them sharply. Voltaire had no problem with representative institutions where educated, property-owning men made decisions for society. This was efficient and produced better outcomes than direct participation by ignorant masses. Representatives could deliberate rationally without popular passion interfering. Rousseau was deeply skeptical of representation. The social contract stated bluntly that sovereignty couldn't be represented. The moment people elected representatives to make laws for them, they ceased to be free. They became subjects of those representatives. True freedom required direct participation in lawmaking, not delegating that power to others. This difference reflected their opposing views on human equality. Voltaire accepted natural inequality in ability, intelligence, and judgment. Some people were simply better equipped to govern than others. Recognizing this and giving power to the capable was rational. Pretending everyone was equally qualified for political decision-making was democratic nonsense. Rousseau insisted on fundamental human equality. Differences in ability existed but didn't justify political domination. Everyone possessed the capacity to understand their interests and contribute to determining the common good. Political equality wasn't about identical abilities, but about equal right to participate in self-government. Their ideas influenced different revolutionary traditions. Voltaire's emphasis on rights, tolerance, and rational reform shaped liberal constitutionalism. His critique of arbitrary power and religious authority informed the American Constitution and French revolutionary reforms. But he would have been horrified by revolutionary violence and mob rule. Rousseau became the French Revolution's patron saint, though his actual views were often misunderstood or distorted. Revolutionaries cited the general will to justify radical measures, used his rhetoric of popular sovereignty to claim authority, and invoked his name for policies he might not have supported. The Terror claimed legitimacy partly through Rousseauan ideas about the people's will. This revolutionary appropriation troubled later interpreters. Did Rousseau's philosophy logically lead to totalitarianism? Could popular sovereignty justify oppression in the name of the general will? These questions became urgent as 20th century totalitarian movements claimed democratic legitimacy while crushing individual freedom. Defenders of Rousseau argue he would have rejected revolutionary violence and dictatorship, claiming to represent the people's will. His emphasis on equality, participation, and the common good didn't justify terror or oppression. Later distortions of his ideas shouldn't be attributed to him. Voltaire's legacy also faced complications. His enlightened absolutism could excuse authoritarian governments claiming to rule rationally and scientifically. His distrust of popular participation could justify exclusionary systems denying most people political voice. His emphasis on property rights could protect inequality and economic domination. The practical question remained, which approach better protected human freedom and promoted human welfare? Voltaire's system seemed more realistic and achievable, but preserved hierarchy and limited most people's political agency. Rousseau's vision demanded conditions rarely achieved but offered genuine freedom through self-government. Modern democratic theory tries to combine elements from both. Constitutional protections for individual rights and minority interests reflect Voltairean concerns. Popular sovereignty and democratic participation embody Rousseauan principles. Representative democracy attempts to reconcile efficiency with legitimacy, but tensions between these approaches persist. The debate about who should govern and on what basis continues. Should policy be made by experts and technocrats or through popular participation? Should economic inequality be tolerated for efficiency's sake or reduced to preserve political equality? Should individual rights constrain what majorities can do? Rousseau and Voltaire articulated opposing positions on these questions that remain unresolved. By the late 1750s, Rousseau's mental state was deteriorating. He had always been sensitive to criticism and prone to interpreting disagreements as personal attacks. But after the publication of Emile and the Social Contract in 1762, his suspicion and fear intensified dramatically. Both books were condemned by authorities. Emile was burned publicly in Paris and Geneva. Warrants were issued for Rousseau's arrest. These threats were real, not imagined. Rousseau had to flee France to avoid imprisonment. His books were genuinely banned, his ideas officially condemned as dangerous. Religious and political authorities did oppose him. The persecution he feared had actual basis in reality. The problem was that Rousseau's response went far beyond rational caution into paranoid delusion. He began seeing conspiracies everywhere. Friends who offered help were secretly plotting against him. Former allies were spreading lies and turning others against him. Even strangers on the streets seemed to recognize and mock him. The entire philosophe network, including Voltaire, D'Alembert, and Diderot, had supposedly formed a conspiracy to destroy his reputation and drive him mad. This belief in a vast conspiracy was completely unfounded. While individual philosophes criticized Rousseau's ideas and some personal behavior, no organized plot existed. His former friends were hurt and angry about his accusations, but they weren't coordinating efforts to persecute him. The conspiracy was Rousseau's creation, a paranoid interpretation of ordinary intellectual disagreement and criticism. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, witnessed Rousseau's paranoia firsthand. In 1766, Hume helped Rousseau find refuge in England, securing him a pension and accommodation. Rousseau initially expressed gratitude. Then, within months, he became convinced that Hume was the conspiracy's leader, coordinating efforts to mock and persecute him across Europe. Rousseau accused Hume based on the flimsiest evidence: a misunderstood joke, a letter he claimed was forged, various innocent actions reinterpreted as sinister. Hume was bewildered and hurt. He had genuinely tried to help Rousseau and received paranoid accusations in return. The public quarrel that followed damaged both men's reputations, though most observers recognized Rousseau's accusations were irrational. Voltaire played a role in Rousseau's paranoid fantasies, though perhaps less centrally than Rousseau sometimes claimed. The two men had exchanged critical letters about each other's work. Voltaire had mocked Rousseau's ideas in Candide and elsewhere. He had also anonymously published a pamphlet exposing Rousseau's abandonment of his children, a devastating attack on Rousseau's moral credibility. This pamphlet genuinely was persecution of a kind. Voltaire deliberately publicized information that damaged Rousseau's reputation at a vulnerable moment. His motivation combined philosophical disagreement with personal malice. He wanted to discredit Rousseau and reduce his influence. This was calculated hostility, not friendly disagreement. But Rousseau's response went far beyond acknowledging this specific attack. He incorporated Voltaire into his larger conspiracy theory, imagining coordinated efforts and elaborate plots that didn't exist. Voltaire's actual hostility was intermittent and opportunistic, not part of some organized campaign. He had better things to do than dedicate himself to destroying Rousseau. The pattern repeated with others. Diderot, who had been Rousseau's close friend, received paranoid accusations after their friendship ended. Madame d'Épinay, who had hosted Rousseau at her estate, became another supposed conspirator when the arrangement ended badly. Anyone who criticized Rousseau or with whom he quarreled became part of the imagined plot. Rousseau's later writings reflect this paranoid worldview. The Confessions, written in the 1760s, portrayed his life as a series of persecutions by a hostile world. The dialogues, Rousseau judge of Jean-Jacques, written in the early 1770s, presented his case against the supposed conspiracy through imagined conversations. The Reveries of a Solitary Walker, his final work, showed him retreating into solitude and nature to escape persecution. These works are psychologically revealing, but historically unreliable. Rousseau genuinely believed in the persecution he described, but much of it existed only in his mind. The Confessions blends accurate memories with paranoid interpretations and probable fabrications. Distinguishing what really happened from what Rousseau imagined happened is often impossible. The question of what caused this mental deterioration troubled Rousseau's contemporaries and has interested scholars since. Medical explanations suggest possible physical causes: chronic illness, lead poisoning from various sources, neurological conditions. Psychological explanations point to childhood trauma, personality disorders, or progressive mental illness. Rousseau himself blamed his persecutors. In his view, he was a fundamentally good person driven to paranoia by actual persecution. The conspiracy was real, his response was justified. This self-understanding reflected his inability to recognize his own condition. He couldn't distinguish between reasonable caution about real threats and irrational fear of imagined conspiracies. Voltaire's response to Rousseau's paranoia mixed mockery with some genuine concern. He found Rousseau's accusations ridiculous and said so publicly. He enjoyed exposing what he saw as Rousseau's hypocrisy and irrationality. But some private letters suggest he recognized Rousseau was genuinely unwell, not simply dishonest or theatrical. The relationship between Rousseau's philosophy and his mental state raises uncomfortable questions. Did his emphasis on authenticity and natural feeling, his rejection of social conventions and rational discourse contribute to his inability to function in normal society? Did his political philosophy's emphasis on unity and the general will reflect a mind uncomfortable with disagreement and diversity? Some critics have argued that Rousseau's ideas were symptoms rather than causes, that his paranoia shaped his philosophy rather than vice versa. His emphasis on corrupt society persecuting innocent individuals might have reflected his personal psychology projected onto political theory. His idealization of solitude and nature might have rationalized his increasing inability to maintain relationships. Defenders of Rousseau counter that his ideas had independent philosophical merit regardless of his mental state. Political philosophy should be judged on its logic and implications, not the psychological profile of who proposed it. Dismissing Rousseau's thought as paranoid projection ignores its genuine insights and historical influence. The practical implications of Rousseau's paranoia appeared in his later life. He moved frequently, unable to stay anywhere long before becoming convinced people were plotting against him. He broke with almost everyone who tried to help him. He lived in increasing isolation, surviving on music copying and eventually a pension arranged by others despite his suspicions. By the time Rousseau died in 1778, he had alienated most former friends and supporters. The small circle remaining consisted of people willing to tolerate his accusations and suspicions. Even Thérèse Levasseur, who stayed with him throughout, occasionally became target of his paranoid thoughts. He died isolated, convinced the world had conspired against him. Voltaire died the same year, having maintained his social connections and intellectual engagement until the end. The contrast in their final years was stark. Where Voltaire remained productive, sociable, and engaged with the world despite physical decline, Rousseau retreated into paranoid isolation. Their different trajectories reflected their different philosophies and personalities carried to their logical conclusions. The question of whether Rousseau's persecution was primarily real or imagined remains complex. He faced genuine threats, arrest warrants, book burnings, exile from multiple countries. But he also imagined vast conspiracies that didn't exist. Separating justified caution from paranoid delusion requires careful attention to evidence, which Rousseau himself couldn't maintain. Voltaire's relationship with Émilie du Châtelet demonstrated his capacity to treat a woman as intellectual equal. For 15 years, they worked together on scientific and philosophical projects. He consulted her about his writings, valued her mathematical abilities that exceeded his own, and acknowledged her contributions publicly. This wasn't common behavior for 18th century men, even enlightened ones. His writings occasionally advocated for women's intellectual capacities. He pointed out that nothing in female nature prevented scientific or philosophical achievement. Women's exclusion from education and public life was social convention, not natural necessity. If educated properly, women could contribute as much as men to arts, sciences, and philosophy. This position had limits. Voltaire didn't advocate for political rights for women or fundamental restructuring of gender relations. He thought exceptional women like du Châtelet should be recognized and given opportunity, but he didn't question whether ordinary women should remain in domestic roles. His feminism, such as it was elitist and individualistic. His portrayal of women in his literary works was mixed. Some female characters were intelligent and capable, others were victims of male oppression deserving sympathy. But many were stock figures, scheming, vain, emotional, irrational. Voltaire could recognize individual women's abilities while maintaining general prejudices about female nature. In practice, Voltaire benefited from women's labor without necessarily acknowledging it. His niece, Madame Denis, served as his housekeeper and companion for years, managing practical affairs that freed him to write. This arrangement was so common it seemed natural, but it meant a woman's work enabled a man's achievement without receiving equivalent recognition. Voltaire never systematically addressed women's status or gender inequality as political and social issues. His concern for justice and opposition to arbitrary power didn't extend to examining how women were systematically subordinated. He could see specific injustices toward individual women without recognizing structural oppression. Rousseau's views on women were far more explicitly restrictive and theoretically developed. Book 5 of Émile, dealing with Sophie's education, presented his philosophy of gender relations. Women and men had fundamentally different natures suited to different roles. These differences required different education and different places in society. According to Rousseau, men were naturally active, strong, and rational. Women were naturally passive, weak, and governed by feeling. These weren't arbitrary social conventions, but essential characteristics rooted in biology and reinforced by social function. Women bore and nursed children. This natural role shaped their entire being. Sophie's education prepared her for her proper role, pleasing her husband, managing the household, and raising children. She learned domestic skills, how to be charming and agreeable, how to support and obey her husband. She didn't need Émile's independence or self-reliance because she would depend on her husband. Her fulfillment came through serving his needs and raising their children. This subordination was natural and beneficial in Rousseau's view. Women weren't inferior but different, with their own proper sphere. The problem with modern society wasn't that it subordinated women, but that it corrupted their nature, making them artificial and vain. Proper gender relations required both sexes to accept their natural roles. The contradiction between Rousseau's egalitarian political philosophy and his gender hierarchy is glaring. If humans were born free and legitimate authority required consent of the governed, why didn't this apply to women? If subordination to unchosen authority was slavery, why was women's subordination to husbands natural and proper? Rousseau never adequately addressed this contradiction. He simply asserted that gender relations were different from political relations, governed by nature rather than convention. But this left unexplained why natural differences justified political subordination in one case but not others. Why didn't natural differences in strength, intelligence, or ability among men justify hierarchy among them? His treatment of women reflected deep anxieties about female power and sexuality. He worried that women's influence over men could corrupt politics and morality. If women left their proper domestic sphere and entered public life, they would use sexual power to manipulate men. The salon culture he criticized was partly about women's intellectual and social influence. Rousseau's personal relationships with women reinforced these views. His mother died in childbirth, creating perhaps an unconscious resentment. His relationship with Thérèse Levasseur fit his theory. She was uneducated, domestic, subordinate. He resisted marrying her for decades, suggesting discomfort with making her an equal partner, even formally. The women who helped Rousseau throughout his life often received little gratitude. Madame de Warren supported him as a young man. He later portrayed her as corrupting influence. Madame d'Épinay provided him housing and financial help. He quarreled with her and made accusations. He seemed unable to accept help from women without resenting the dependence it created. His novel Julie, or The New Eloise, presented an idealized version of feminine virtue. Julie was passionate but ultimately obedient, intelligent but accepting of male authority, influential within her domestic sphere but not challenging male dominance. She represented Rousseau's fantasy of perfect womanhood, strong enough to be interesting but subordinate enough to be safe. The contrast with Voltaire's actual relationship with Du Châtelet is striking. Voltaire worked with a woman as collaborative partner, respected her superior abilities in some areas, and maintained the relationship through mutual intellectual interest. Rousseau theorized about ideal womanhood while having dysfunctional relationships with actual women. Their different views on women connected to their broader philosophies. Voltaire's rationalism allowed him to recognize that women possessed reason and could use it effectively. Nothing in rational analysis suggested female nature prevented intellectual achievement. Social barriers to women's education were prejudices that reason should overcome. Rousseau's emphasis on nature and essential characteristics led him to see gender differences as fundamental and determinative. Women's nature suited them for domestic roles. Fighting this nature would make them and society miserable. Authentic living required accepting one's natural place, which for women meant subordination. The political implications differed significantly. Voltaire's position, though limited, opened possibility for women's inclusion in intellectual and public life based on individual merit. If women could reason as well as men, then capable women deserved access to education and opportunity. This was the seed of liberal feminism. Rousseau's position reinforced traditional gender hierarchy with philosophical justification. His influence on Romanticism and 19th century thought included this gender conservatism. The separate spheres ideology that confined middle-class women to domestic life drew partly on Rousseauan ideas about natural gender differences. Neither man engaged seriously with women's actual perspectives or experiences. They theorized about women without seriously consulting women about their own nature and interests. Women's voices were largely absent from Enlightenment discourse, though some like Mary Wollstonecraft would soon challenge these exclusions. The women in their lives often had more complex views than the men's theories suggested. Du Châtelet pursued her intellectual work despite social barriers, demonstrating that women could achieve at highest levels when given opportunity. Thérèse Levasseur stayed with Rousseau despite his treatment, though her own thoughts about their relationship remain largely unknown. Modern feminism has thoroughly criticized both men's views while acknowledging differences between them. Voltaire at least recognized women's rational capacities and worked with women as intellectual equals, even if he didn't challenge structural subordination. Rousseau built elaborate theory justifying women's subordination, making him worse in systematic way. The historical influence of their views persists. Liberal arguments for women's equality based on rational capacity trace partly to Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire. Romantic idealization of motherhood and domestic femininity draws on Rousseau. Both strands shaped modern debates about gender, though neither anticipated the full scope of feminist critique. Voltaire's prose was a weapon. Clear, precise, devastating in its logic and wit, it cut through pomposity and exposed absurdity with surgical precision. He wrote quickly, producing enormous quantities of letters, essays, plays, histories, and novels. The writing seemed effortless, though this appearance required considerable craft and revision. His style prioritized clarity above all else. Every sentence should communicate its meaning immediately. No word should be wasted or unclear. Complex ideas should be expressed in simple language accessible to intelligent readers. This wasn't dumbing down, but distilling thought to its essence. Obscurity usually concealed fuzzy thinking or deliberate deception. Wit was Voltaire's signature weapon. A well-placed ironic comment could demolish an argument more effectively than lengthy refutation. Candide's repeated insistence that this was the best of all possible worlds while describing horror after horror mocked philosophical optimism more powerfully than direct argument could. Readers got the joke and remembered it. He mastered the art of saying dangerous things safely through irony and indirection. By putting his own views in characters' mouths or presenting them as questions rather than assertions, he could express ideas that would be censored if stated directly. The authorities understood this technique but often couldn't prosecute him for it without looking foolish. Voltaire's letters revealed his conversational brilliance preserved in writing. They mixed serious discussion with gossip, philosophical argument with witty observation, practical business with intellectual speculation. He maintained correspondence with hundreds of people across Europe, using letters to build networks, influence opinion, and work out ideas. His historical writing broke from previous traditions. Earlier histories were either dry chronicles or moralistic tales about great men. Voltaire tried to write history that explained how societies actually functioned, their commerce, customs, beliefs, and material conditions. He wanted to understand human development, not just record events. The theatrical works showed different aspects of his talent. His tragedies followed classical forms but addressed contemporary themes: religious tolerance, political justice, the conflict between passion and duty. They were meant to be performed, to move audiences emotionally while conveying ideas. Some succeeded brilliantly in their time, though few remain in repertory today. His novels, particularly Candide, demonstrated how fiction could convey philosophy more effectively than treatises. The picaresque adventures, absurd situations, and cartoonish characters made serious points about evil, suffering, and human nature. Readers who would never tackle a philosophical essay happily read Candide's entertaining story and absorbed its message. This variety in form and genre reflected Voltaire's belief that different purposes required different approaches. Philosophy demanded clear argument. History needed narrative and explanation. Tragedy worked through emotion. Satire used humor and exaggeration. A good writer mastered multiple forms and chose appropriately. Rousseau's writing was entirely different in style and purpose. Where Voltaire sought clarity and precision, Rousseau poured out emotion and personal feeling. His sentences were often long and complex, building through subordinate clauses to emotional climaxes. Reading Rousseau was like listening to someone think aloud, following thoughts wherever they led. The Confessions pioneered a new kind of writing, extended autobiographical introspection. Rousseau examined his entire life in detail, revealing shameful acts and private feelings no one had publicly confessed before. He wrote as if exposing his innermost self completely, holding nothing back. Whether this transparency was genuine or another form of self-presentation remains debatable. This confessional mode created intimacy between writer and reader. Rousseau seemed to speak directly to each reader as an individual, sharing secrets and seeking understanding. This personal quality made readers feel they knew him, even those who never met him. It created powerful emotional connections that more impersonal writing couldn't achieve. His philosophical works combined argument with literary art. The Second Discourse used hypothetical history of human development, creating narrative that was part philosophy, part speculative fiction. The Social Contract mixed political theory with rhetoric designed to inspire as much as convince. Even his most theoretical writing had emotional force. Julie, or the New Eloise, was perhaps his most influential work during his lifetime. An epistolary novel about love, virtue, and moral struggle, it moved readers to tears. People wrote Rousseau saying the characters felt real to them, asking for advice as if Julie and Saint-Preux actually existed. The novel's emotional power was unprecedented. This emphasis on feeling over form sometimes produced writing that was repetitive or poorly organized. Rousseau would make the same point multiple times in different words, building intensity through accumulation rather than logical progression. His work required patient readers willing to follow emotional development rather than tight argument. He wrote slowly, revising extensively, often destroying draft after draft. Unlike Voltaire's fluent productivity, Rousseau's writing process was tormented. He struggled to express exactly what he felt, never satisfied that words captured the inner truth he sought to convey. The finished works showed this labor, their emotional intensity hard-won through effort. The Reveries of a Solitary Walker, written near the end of his life, showed Rousseau's style at its most characteristic. 10 walks provided structure for meditations on nature, memory, and his own life. The writing wandered like the walks themselves, following associations rather than predetermined plans. This created dreamy, contemplative prose unlike anything written before. Rousseau's influence on literary culture was profound. He helped create Romanticism's emphasis on personal feeling, individual experience, and nature as source of truth. His confessional mode influenced generations of autobiographers. His novel's emotional intensity shaped how love and passion were written about. His style proved that breaking classical rules could produce powerful effects. The contrast between Voltaire's and Rousseau's styles reflected their philosophical differences. Voltaire believed truth was accessible to reason and should be communicated clearly. Good writing made complex ideas understandable. Style should serve thought, not obscure it. The goal was convincing rational readers through clear argument. Rousseau believed some truths couldn't be reduced to clear propositions. Emotional and moral truths required different expression. Style should convey feeling and create sympathy, not just communicate ideas. The goal was moving readers, helping them feel truth rather than just understand it intellectually. Their different audiences appreciated these different styles. Voltaire appealed to sophisticated readers who enjoyed wit, irony, and elegant argument. His readers were likely educated, worldly, comfortable with abstract thinking. They wanted to be entertained while being enlightened, to smile while learning. Rousseau reached different readers, often younger, more emotionally open, less interested in classical refinement. His readers wanted intensity, authenticity, emotional engagement. They were willing to work through difficult passages if rewarded with moments of recognition and feeling. Many were women who found in Rousseau emotional depth missing in other Enlightenment writing. The question of which style was superior depends on what writing should accomplish. If clarity and persuasive force matter most, Voltaire excels. If emotional depth and personal revelation matter more, Rousseau succeeds. Both proved influential, suggesting different styles served different purposes. Their writing reflected their personalities. Voltaire was sociable, quick-witted, comfortable performing his intelligence for others. His writing had these performance qualities: clever, controlled, designed to impress and convince. Rousseau was introspective, emotionally intense, uncomfortable with social performance. His writing was confession and exploration, less polished but more revealing. Modern writers still divide between these approaches. Some prioritize clarity, precision, and logical argument. Others embrace emotional complexity, personal voice, and associative structure. The Voltairean and Rousseauan traditions both continue, sometimes in the same writer attempting different kinds of work. Geneva in the 18th century was a small republic, independent and proud. Unlike most of Europe, it had no king or nobility. Instead, a complex system of councils governed, with citizenship limited to men from established families. The city was Protestant, specifically Calvinist, maintaining strict moral supervision over residents' behavior. This was the world that shaped both Rousseau and Voltaire, though they related to it very differently. Rousseau was born in Geneva in 1712. His family belonged to the citizen class, a privileged group below the wealthy patricians but above the residents who had no political rights. His father, Isaac, took pride in this citizen status and passed that pride to his son. Geneva represented republican virtue, civic equality among citizens, and Protestant moral seriousness. But Rousseau's actual experience of Geneva was troubled from the start. His mother died days after his birth. His father fled when Jean-Jacques was 10, leaving the boy in others' care. At 16, Rousseau left Geneva, arriving late one evening to find the city gates closed. Rather than waiting until morning, he walked away and didn't return to live there. This departure was practically insignificant but symbolically important to Rousseau. He later portrayed it as exile from his natural home, forced departure from the republic he loved. The reality was less dramatic, a teenage apprentice unhappy with his situation leaving for adventure, but Rousseau transformed it into a mythic loss. Over the following decades, Rousseau maintained complicated relationship with Geneva. He converted to Catholicism, which cost him his citizenship. He later reconverted to Protestantism and regained citizen status. He dedicated his second discourse to Geneva in flowery terms, praising its republican virtue, but he never moved back. The letter to D'Alembert on the theater, defending Geneva's ban on theatrical performances, marked a turning point. Rousseau positioned himself as Geneva's defender against cosmopolitan corruption. He claimed to understand the city's virtue better than Genevans themselves. This presumption annoyed actual Geneva residents, who didn't need a man living in France to tell them how to run their republic. When Émile was published in 1762, Geneva's authorities condemned and burned it, just as Paris did. Rousseau was shocked and hurt. He had idealized Geneva as more enlightened than Catholic France, more committed to freedom of thought. Having his own city reject his work felt like personal betrayal. His citizenship was revoked again. Rousseau responded by renouncing his citizenship publicly in a dramatic letter. If Geneva wouldn't accept him, he wouldn't accept Geneva. The small republic he had praised as exemplar of virtue was now just another corrupt state persecuting honest thinkers. This renunciation marked final break with the city of his birth. But he never stopped thinking of himself as Genevan. In the Confessions and other writings, Geneva remained the standard against which he judged other places. Its republicanism, however flawed in practice, represented the political ideal. Being Genevan was central to his identity even after he renounced citizenship. The relationship was one-sided. Geneva's authorities and citizens mostly found Rousseau embarrassing. His personal life was scandalous by Genevan moral standards. His writings attacked religion and proposed dangerous political ideas. His claim to represent Genevan values while living in France seemed presumptuous. They were happy to be rid of him. Voltaire's connection to Geneva came later and differently. He wasn't born there but moved near the city in 1755, purchasing an estate at Les Délices just outside Genevan territory. He later bought Ferney, even closer to Geneva but on French soil. These locations let him access Geneva's relative freedom while maintaining escape route into France if necessary. Voltaire enjoyed Geneva's cultivated society. The city's intellectual and merchant elite appreciated his company. He attended events, cultivated friendships, and involved himself in local affairs. But he never pretended to be Genevan or to represent the city's values. He was a sophisticated Parisian living nearby, not an adopted citizen. His relationship with Geneva's authorities was pragmatic. They watched him suspiciously, knowing his reputation for controversial ideas and his facility for evading censorship. He was careful not to provoke them unnecessarily, publishing his most dangerous works elsewhere. As long as he didn't directly challenge Genevan law or morals, they tolerated his presence. The theater controversy put Voltaire at odds with Geneva. D'Alembert's encyclopedia article suggesting Geneva should permit theaters had been inspired partly by Voltaire, who loved drama and wanted a theater near his home. Rousseau's passionate defense of the theater ban implicitly criticized Voltaire's influence on Geneva's culture. Voltaire responded with mockery but also genuine frustration. Geneva's prohibition of theater seemed to him provincial narrow-mindedness. The city wanted to be considered cultured and enlightened but banned one of civilization's great art forms. This contradiction amused and annoyed him. When Rousseau's Émile was condemned in Geneva, Voltaire played a role in the persecution. He encouraged authorities to act against the work and distributed material attacking Rousseau's character. This was partly philosophical disagreement, but also personal malice. Voltaire enjoyed seeing his rivals' idealized Geneva reject him. Yet Voltaire also faced limits in Geneva. His own works were monitored and sometimes prohibited. When he tried to establish a theater near the city, authorities resisted. They appreciated having a famous writer nearby, but didn't want him corrupting Genevan morals. He remained an outsider, tolerated but not embraced. Both men ultimately left disappointed. Rousseau lost the idealized republic that existed largely in his imagination. Voltaire gave up trying to reform Geneva's cultural restrictions and focused on his Ferny estate. Neither could make Geneva what he wanted it to be. The city's treatment of them reflected its own tensions. Geneva prided itself on republican virtue and Protestant reform, but maintained rigid moral supervision and limited political participation. It valued learning and culture, but feared innovation and change. It wanted to be cosmopolitan, but preserve its distinctive identity. Rousseau represented Geneva to itself and to Europe as exemplar of republican virtue. But real Geneva didn't match this ideal and resented being told it should. His idealization was burden as much as compliment, creating standards the actual city couldn't meet and didn't necessarily want to meet. Voltaire represented what Geneva might become if it embraced Enlightenment culture more fully, sophisticated, tolerant, cultured. But Geneva wasn't ready for this transformation and didn't trust Voltaire's motives. His presence was stimulating but also threatening to traditional values the city still held. After both men died, Geneva eventually moved closer to Voltaire's vision. The theater ban was lifted. Cultural restrictions eased. The city became more cosmopolitan and less narrowly Protestant, but it also preserved republican institutions and civic pride that Rousseau had celebrated. In some sense, Geneva became a compromise between their visions. The city erected monuments to both men eventually, claiming them both as important figures in Genevan history. This was ironic given how both relationships ended, but it reflected Geneva's complex identity, proud of its republican tradition, Rousseau, but also committed to culture and progress, Voltaire. Neither man fully belonged to Geneva or anywhere else. Rousseau was born there but lived as perpetual exile. Voltaire chose proximity but remained outsider. Both were cosmopolitan intellectuals who helped create European Enlightenment culture that transcended local identities. Yet both cared about Geneva's response to them more than they admitted. Their different losses of Geneva symbolized their different philosophies. Rousseau lost an idealized community he had mythologized, mourning loss of belonging he perhaps never really had. Voltaire lost a convenient location and potential cultural project, moving on to other opportunities. One took it personally and emotionally, the other pragmatically and philosophically. In 1750, Voltaire accepted Frederick II of Prussia's invitation to join his court at Potsdam. Frederick styled himself a philosopher king, corresponding with intellectuals across Europe, writing poetry and philosophical essays, and claiming to rule according to Enlightenment principles. For Voltaire, the invitation seemed to offer the perfect arrangement: a generous stipend, intellectual companionship, and influence over an enlightened monarch. The relationship began promisingly. Frederick treated Voltaire as honored guest and intellectual companion. They discussed philosophy, critiqued each other's writings, and enjoyed elaborate dinners with other intellectuals Frederick had assembled. Voltaire worked on revising his historical and philosophical works while enjoying the security and prestige of royal patronage. But tensions emerged quickly. Frederick was king first, philosopher second. When his political interests conflicted with philosophical principles, politics won. He fought wars, maintained authoritarian control, and used people according to his needs. Voltaire discovered that friendship with a king was never between equals, no matter how enlightened the king claimed to be. The relationship deteriorated over 3 years. Frederick's mockery of Voltaire's business dealings, Voltaire's criticism of Frederick's poetry, various personal slights and misunderstandings accumulated. When Voltaire tried to leave in 1753, Frederick made the departure deliberately humiliating. Soldiers detained Voltaire at Frankfurt, confiscated his papers, and held him for weeks. The message was clear: you don't leave a king until the king dismisses you. Voltaire never forgave this treatment, though he and Frederick eventually resumed distant correspondence. The experience taught him that cultivating powerful patrons was dangerous no matter how enlightened they seemed. After leaving Prussia, he settled at Ferney, positioning himself on borders where he could escape if threatened but otherwise maintaining independence. What Frederick read privately was another matter. His library contained works by many philosophers, including Rousseau. Whether he read Rousseau secretly, as has sometimes been claimed, is uncertain. The evidence suggests Frederick knew Rousseau's work and found it interesting despite fundamental disagreements. Frederick's political philosophy aligned more closely with Voltaire's than Rousseau's. He believed in strong centralized authority guided by reason and efficiency. He had no patience for popular sovereignty or general will. The idea that legitimacy required citizen participation struck him as naive and impractical. Monarchs should rule wisely, not answer to masses. Yet Frederick reportedly admired certain aspects of Rousseau's writing. The Second Discourse's critique of civilization and inequality might have resonated with Frederick's own complicated relationship with culture and power. The social contract's vision of civic virtue and dedication to common good, if not its democratic implications, reflected values Frederick claimed to honor. There's no evidence Frederick and Rousseau ever corresponded directly. Rousseau would have been uncomfortable approaching a king given his principles. Frederick probably found Rousseau too radical and unstable to bother cultivating, but Frederick's intellectual curiosity meant he read widely, including authors whose politics he rejected. The notion of Frederick reading Rousseau in secret, sometimes suggested in historical accounts, is likely exaggerated. Frederick was monarch. He could read whatever he wanted openly. If he was discreet about reading Rousseau, it was probably because he didn't want to encourage ideas he thought dangerous, not because he feared discovery. What's certain is that Frederick's relationship with Enlightenment philosophy was selective and instrumental. He enjoyed intellectual conversation and considered himself philosophically sophisticated. But he used philosophy to serve his interests as monarch, not to question whether monarchy itself was legitimate. This was precisely the problem Rousseau identified with enlightened despotism. Voltaire's experience with Frederick illustrated the limits of his own political approach. Cultivating enlightened rulers could produce specific reforms and protections for individuals. Frederick did reduce torture, promote religious tolerance in some areas, and support arts and sciences, but the relationship remained fundamentally unequal, with the intellectual dependent on royal favor. Rousseau would have predicted this outcome. His philosophy rejected the premise that good outcomes from enlightened despotism justified the system. Even if Frederick governed wisely, Prussian subjects remained unfree. They lived under laws they hadn't made, dependent on one man's will. This was incompatible with human dignity, regardless of how benevolently the monarch acted. The contrast between Voltaire's quoting of Frederick and Rousseau's refusal to seek royal patronage reflected their different priorities. Voltaire accepted inequality and hierarchy as necessary, focusing on improving conditions within existing structures. Rousseau insisted on the principle of legitimate authority, willing to suffer poverty rather than compromise. Frederick's actual governance showed the contradictions in enlightened absolutism. He promoted education but maintained rigid class distinctions. He reduced some traditional cruelties but expanded Prussian military power through conscription and aggressive warfare. He supported intellectual freedom selectively, tolerating views he found interesting while suppressing actual challenges to his authority. His treatment of Voltaire revealed the reality beneath the philosophical pose. When Voltaire was useful and entertaining, Frederick valued him. When he became inconvenient or troublesome, Frederick reminded him forcefully of who held power. The humiliation at Frankfurt showed how quickly enlightened friendship could revert to raw assertion of authority. Rousseau would never have placed himself in this position. His suspicion of the powerful, his insistence on independence, his unwillingness to accept subordinate status even when it came with benefits, all protected him from this kind of disillusionment. He might have lived in poverty, but no king ever imprisoned him for trying to leave. Yet Rousseau's approach had its own costs. His isolation and poverty were real hardships. His refusal to work within existing power structures meant he influenced ideas but not immediate policy. Voltaire's pragmatic engagement with power, despite its humiliations, allowed him to help specific individuals and advance concrete reforms. The question of which approach was more effective remained unresolved. Voltaire saved people from execution through his connections with the powerful. Rousseau inspired revolutionary changes in how people thought about political legitimacy. Both contributions mattered, but they required different strategies and different relationships with power. Frederick himself represented a historical dead end. Enlightened absolutism failed to prevent the revolutions that swept Europe in later decades. Monarchs claiming to rule rationally while maintaining absolute power couldn't satisfy demands for genuine political participation. The future belonged more to Rousseau's vision of popular sovereignty than Voltaire's enlightened despotism. But the immediate impact favored Voltaire's approach. Throughout the 18th century, reforming monarchs like Frederick, Catherine of Russia, and Joseph of Austria implemented changes influenced by Enlightenment ideas. These reforms improved many lives even though they left fundamental power structures intact. Practical incrementalism achieved results while revolutionary ideals remained distant. The library metaphor captures something important about intellectual influence. Frederick might have read both Voltaire and Rousseau, but he integrated their ideas selectively into his own thinking. Philosophers could shape how rulers thought, but rulers decided which ideas to adopt and how to implement them. This gave intellectuals influence but not control. Voltaire understood this dynamic and worked within it. He knew he couldn't change Frederick's commitment to absolute monarchy, so he focused on encouraging specific reforms and promoting tolerance. This required accepting the broader system while trying to improve it marginally. The strategy had successes and failures, benefits and costs. Rousseau rejected this entire game. The relationship between philosopher and king was inherently corrupting because it required the philosopher to defer to power rather than speak truth. Even if the king listened and implemented good policies, the structure remained wrong. Rousseau wouldn't compromise his principles for practical gains. Their different choices shaped their legacies. Voltaire became associated with practical reform, incremental progress, and working within existing systems to improve them. Rousseau became associated with radical critique, revolutionary change, and refusing to accept unjust systems even when costly. Both approaches have advocates and critics today. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, both Voltaire and Rousseau had been dead for 11 years. Yet the revolutionaries claimed both as intellectual fathers. The Pantheon, converted from a church to a monument honoring great Frenchmen, received their remains in elaborate ceremonies. Rousseau was interred in 1794, Voltaire in 1791, both honored as heroes of revolutionary France. This dual paternity was paradoxical because Voltaire and Rousseau had advocated such different politics. Voltaire supported constitutional monarchy, religious tolerance, legal reform, and protection of individual rights. Rousseau advocated popular sovereignty, general will, civic virtue, and democratic participation. Yet revolutionaries claimed both as inspirations. The early revolutionary period from 1789 to 1792 drew heavily on Voltaire's ideas. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen reflected his emphasis on individual liberty, legal equality, and freedom of expression. Religious tolerance, reduction of church power, and rational legal reform all echoed Voltairean principles. Moderate revolutionaries saw themselves implementing Enlightenment ideals Voltaire had articulated. The attack on the Catholic Church particularly showed Voltaire's influence. Revolutionaries seized church property, required clergy to swear allegiance to the state, and reduced religious authority over civil affairs. This anti-clericalism directly reflected Voltaire's lifelong campaign against church power and superstition. "Crush the infamous thing" became revolutionary rallying cry. Legal reforms also followed Voltairean principles. The revolution abolished torture, reformed criminal procedures, and established equality before the law. These changes reflected Voltaire's specific campaigns against judicial murder and arbitrary punishment. His work on the Calas case and other miscarriages of justice had demonstrated both the problems and potential solutions. But as the revolution radicalized after 1792, Rousseau's influence became more prominent. The Jacobins, who dominated during the Terror, claimed Rousseau as their philosopher. Robespierre frequently cited the social contract and portrayed himself as implementing Rousseau's vision of virtuous republic governed by general will. The concept of general will became revolutionary doctrine. Jacobins claimed to represent the people's will, which was singular and indivisible. Opposition to the revolution wasn't legitimate political disagreement, but resistance to the general will, essentially treason against the people themselves. This justified crushing dissent violently in the name of popular sovereignty. Rousseau's emphasis on virtue and civic dedication shaped revolutionary culture. Festivals celebrated civic unity and republican virtue. Luxury and aristocratic manners were condemned as corruption. Citizens were supposed to dedicate themselves to the common good rather than private interests. The attempt to create a new type of citizen resembled Rousseau's vision in the social contract. The Terror's violence was also justified through Rousseauan language. Robespierre spoke of forcing people to be free, an infamous phrase from the social contract. If the general will represented true freedom, then compelling obedience to it liberated rather than oppressed. This reasoning justified executing thousands as enemies of liberty itself. Rousseau would likely have been horrified by the Terror. His vision of legitimate authority required genuine consensus and civic participation, not violent coercion by a revolutionary elite. His social contract described ideal conditions, not a blueprint for revolutionary dictatorship. But his language and concepts were appropriated to justify practices he probably wouldn't have endorsed. Voltaire too would have rejected the revolution's violent turn. He opposed fanaticism and mob violence. He valued order and stability, fearing the chaos that revolution could unleash. The September massacres, the terror, the execution of the king, all would have seemed to him precisely the kind of disaster that enlightened reform was meant to prevent. Yet both men contributed ideas that shaped revolutionary thinking. Voltaire's critique of arbitrary authority, emphasis on individual rights, and anti-clericalism provided revolutionary ideology. Rousseau's vision of popular sovereignty, general will, and civic virtue gave revolutionaries their political theory. The revolution combined these elements in ways neither man anticipated or likely would have approved. The moderate phase tried to synthesize both philosophies. Constitutional monarchy with protected individual rights reflected Voltaire. Popular sovereignty and citizen participation reflected Rousseau. The attempt to create political system honoring both ultimately failed, partly because the philosophies were fundamentally incompatible. Different revolutionary factions claimed different philosophical ancestors. Constitutional monarchists cited Voltaire's support for enlightened monarchy and individual liberty. Jacobins claimed Rousseau's popular sovereignty and general will. Each group selectively read their chosen philosopher, ignoring elements that didn't fit their program. The reality was that neither philosopher had provided a complete political program for revolutionary transformation. Voltaire wanted incremental reform within existing structures, not revolutionary overthrow. Rousseau described theoretical conditions for legitimate authority, but didn't explain how to achieve them in actual large, complex societies like France. Revolutionaries faced practical problems neither philosopher had addressed adequately. How to move from absolute monarchy to popular sovereignty. How to balance individual rights with collective will. How to prevent both tyranny of monarchy and tyranny of majority. The philosopher's writings offered concepts and principles, but not concrete answers. The revolution's failure to stabilize, its descent into violence and dictatorship, seemed to validate concerns both men had expressed. Voltaire's fear of mob rule and fanaticism proved prescient. Rousseau's warning that large, unequal societies couldn't easily achieve legitimate popular sovereignty also seemed confirmed. Both had identified real problems without solving them. Napoleon's eventual consolidation of power represented a kind of synthesis neither man would have recognized. Napoleonic France maintained revolutionary legal reforms and meritocratic principles while restoring authoritarian control. Individual rights were protected, but political participation limited. It was neither Voltairean constitutional monarchy nor Rousseauan republic, but something different. The long-term influence of their ideas continued beyond the revolutionary period. Liberal constitutional democracy tried to combine Voltairean individual rights with Rousseauan popular sovereignty. Representative government attempted to maintain legitimacy through popular consent while avoiding direct democracy's perceived dangers. The modern synthesis neither man fully anticipated. Rousseau's influence persisted in democratic and socialist movements, emphasizing popular sovereignty, political equality, and the general good over individual interests. His critique of inequality and emphasis on collective decision-making inspired egalitarian politics. The language of people's will and collective sovereignty remained powerful. Voltaire's legacy shaped liberal constitutionalism, emphasizing individual rights, limited government, religious tolerance, and legal equality. His skepticism about popular rule and emphasis on protecting minorities from majorities influenced liberal political theory. The importance of checks, balances, and protected rights reflected Voltairean concerns. The revolution showed both the power and danger of philosophical ideas applied to political practice. Abstract principles about authority, freedom, and legitimacy had concrete consequences when people tried to implement them. The gap between theory and practice, between ideal and achievable, proved larger than philosophers had recognized. Both men would have found the revolution's invocation of their authority ironic and probably disturbing. They had disagreed profoundly with each other while alive. Having their conflicting ideas claimed simultaneously by the same revolutionary movement would have seemed absurd. Yet this dual paternity reflected genuine complexity and Enlightenment thought that the revolution inherited. In 1778, both Voltaire and Rousseau died, Voltaire in May, Rousseau in July. Neither lived to see the French Revolution that would claim both as intellectual fathers. Neither witnessed how their ideas would shape modern political systems, educational theory, or cultural movements. The question of who won their argument couldn't be answered during their lifetimes. It may not be answerable now. If we measure influence by immediate impact on 18th century thought, Voltaire dominated. He was far more famous during his lifetime. His works circulated widely, were translated into multiple languages, and sparked public debates across Europe. He corresponded with monarchs and influenced actual policy. When educated Europeans discussed Enlightenment, they meant Voltaire more than anyone else. Rousseau was influential but more controversial and less universally respected. Many intellectuals found his ideas extreme or impractical. His personal eccentricities and paranoid accusations damaged his reputation. While certain works like Julie achieved enormous popularity, his political philosophy remained marginal to mainstream Enlightenment discourse until after his death. But measuring influence over longer time periods tells a different story. Rousseau's ideas profoundly shaped Romanticism, democratic theory, educational philosophy, and modern conceptions of authenticity and individual identity. His influence on the French Revolution, however distorted, gave his political philosophy enormous historical impact. Thinkers from Kant to Marx engaged seriously with his work. Voltaire's influence also persisted, but in different ways. His skepticism, irony, and commitment to rational inquiry shaped Enlightenment values that became foundational to modern liberal societies. His campaigns for tolerance and legal reform established precedents for human rights advocacy. His literary style influenced how ideas were communicated to broad audiences. In political philosophy, Rousseau arguably won. Modern democracies claim legitimacy through popular sovereignty, the principle that government authority derives from the governed. This is fundamentally Rousseauan, not Voltairean. Constitutional language about the people as source of political power echoes the social contract more than Voltaire's writings. But in political practice, the victory is mixed. Modern liberal democracies combine popular sovereignty with protection of individual rights against majority power. Representative government limits direct participation. Constitutional constraints prevent the general will from becoming tyrannical. These modifications address Voltairean concerns about democracy's dangers. Educational philosophy shows Rousseau's profound influence. Child-centered education, developmental appropriateness, learning through experience, the importance of emotional and moral development alongside intellectual training all trace partly to Émile. Modern progressive education embodies many Rousseauan principles, however imperfectly implemented. Yet educational practice often follows more Voltairean patterns. Schools transmit cultural knowledge, teach defined curricula, prepare students for existing social roles. The emphasis on literacy, critical thinking, and cultural literacy reflects Enlightenment values Voltaire championed. Practical education balances Rousseauan ideals with Voltairean realism. In questions of religion, Voltaire's influence seems dominant. Secularization, separation of church and state, religious pluralism, skepticism toward institutional religious authority all reflect Voltairean critique more than Rousseauan natural religion. Modern secular societies embody Voltaire's vision of containing religious power while permitting private belief. But Rousseau's emphasis on personal spiritual experience and authentic feeling influenced modern religiosity significantly. The idea that religious truth is found through inner experience rather than institutional authority or rational demonstration resonates in contemporary spirituality. Many people's actual religious practice combines Voltairean skepticism toward institutions with Rousseauan emphasis on personal feeling. Cultural attitudes toward nature and civilization show lasting Rousseauan influence. Environmental movements, critiques of consumer culture, concerns about technology's effects on authentic human experience, yearning for simpler and more natural lifestyles, all echo Rousseau's arguments. The sense that modern civilization costs something important persists. Yet actual behavior follows Voltairean patterns. Most people embrace technological progress, seek material comfort, value cultural sophistication, and have no desire to return to simpler existence. They may romantically idealize nature while living urban lives surrounded by technological conveniences. Rousseau shaped how people feel about civilization. Voltaire shaped what they actually do. The question of happiness and fulfillment remains contested. Rousseau's vision of authenticity, simplicity, and harmony with oneself appeals to many who feel alienated by modern life. Self-help culture, mindfulness movements, and therapeutic discourse often employ Rousseauan language about authentic selfhood and natural feelings. But pursuit of Voltairean goods, comfort, pleasure, intellectual stimulation, cultural engagement remains dominant. Most people want both authenticity and sophisticated culture, both natural simplicity and technological convenience. This attempted synthesis of opposing values reflects the unresolved tension between the two philosophies. On social inequality, Rousseau's critique proved more influential in shaping later political movements. Socialist and egalitarian thought drew heavily on his arguments about property's corrupting effects and the need for economic equality. His analysis of how inequality undermines freedom and dignity became foundational to progressive politics. But Voltaire's acceptance of market economies and property rights shaped actual economic systems in liberal democracies. While inequality is now widely seen as problematic, as Rousseau argued, the solutions generally involve regulation and redistribution within capitalist frameworks rather than Rousseauan economic leveling. In literary and artistic culture, both men's influence persists. Voltaire's clarity, wit, and accessibility set standards for public intellectual writing. His use of irony and satire influenced political and social commentary. Clear thinking and elegant expression remain valued in part because of his example. Rousseau's confessional mode and emphasis on authentic self-expression shaped modern autobiography and personal writing. His emotional intensity and willingness to reveal inner life influenced romantic and later literary movements. The idea that art should express genuine feeling rather than follow classical rules traces partly to him. The arguments themselves haven't been resolved. Should civilization be celebrated as achievement or critiqued as corruption? Should politics emphasize individual rights or collective will? Should education develop natural capacities or transmit cultural knowledge? Should progress be embraced or questioned? These remain live debates where Voltaire and Rousseau articulated enduring positions. Perhaps the most honest answer is that both men won partial victories. Modern societies incorporate elements of both visions while fully satisfying neither. We have Voltairean individual rights within Rousseauan popular sovereignty. We pursue Voltairean progress while feeling Rousseauan doubts. We seek both sophistication and authenticity, both reason and feeling. This mixed outcome might frustrate both philosophers. Voltaire wanted clear, rational progress without romantic nonsense about natural goodness. Rousseau wanted authentic living free from corrupt civilization's compromises. What we have instead is perpetual tension between these values, constant negotiation between opposing goods. Maybe this tension is itself the answer. The unresolved argument between Voltaire and Rousseau reflects genuine complexity in human values and social organization. Their disagreement articulated contradictions that can't be eliminated but only managed. Different times and circumstances call for emphasizing different aspects of their competing visions. If we judge by whose ideas better describe actual modern life, Voltaire probably wins. We live in complex, unequal, technologically advanced societies where most people pursue comfort and pleasure while claiming to value authenticity. This is more Voltairean than Rousseauan, though we dress it in Rousseauan language. If we judge by whose critique cuts deeper and identifies lasting problems, Rousseau might win. His warnings about alienation, inequality's psychological costs, and civilization's corruption speak to dissatisfactions many feel with modern life. Even if we can't implement his alternatives, he articulated problems we still struggle with. But perhaps the real question isn't who won, but what their argument teaches us. It shows that fundamental questions about how to live and organize society don't have simple answers. Different values conflict, different goods compete. The choice between reason and feeling, individual and community, progress and authenticity remains genuinely difficult. Both men contributed essential insights. Voltaire showed the importance of reason, tolerance, and reform. Rousseau revealed the costs of civilization and the value of authenticity. We need both perspectives, held in creative tension, to understand human possibilities and limitations fully. The argument continues because the questions they debated remain urgent. How should we live? What makes us happy? How should we organize society? What do we owe each other? These are permanent human questions, not problems that get solved once and for all. Voltaire and Rousseau gave us two powerful but incompatible sets of answers that still frame our thinking. In the end, their unresolved argument may be their greatest legacy. Not a settled doctrine or clear winner, but an ongoing conversation about fundamental values and competing visions of human flourishing. We inherit both their insights and their disagreements, both their brilliance and their blind spots. The task is not to choose between them, but to learn from both while recognizing that some tensions can't be resolved, only thoughtfully navigated.